Easy. It hurts, she moaned. The rancher froze, then said softly, "It'll be over quick." Blood soaked through her dress as she collapsed at his gate, clutching a mysterious crate like her life depended on it. Her husband was dead. 3 killers were coming, and Jonas Mercer, the loneliest man in Montana, had one choice: turn her away and live in peace, or stand his ground and face the storm that was already thundering across the prairie toward his ranch. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind that night carried the smell of rain and something else, something darker that Jonas Mercer couldn't quite name as he stood on his porch, watching the sun bleed out across the Montana horizon. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve in his body was singing a warning song he hadn't heard since the war. The valley stretched before him like a painting done in shades of gold and amber, the prairie grass swaying in waves that reminded him of the ocean he'd seen once as a boy. His ranch sat at the northern edge of this wilderness, a collection of weathered buildings that had seen better days but still stood firm against whatever the territory threw at them. The main house was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was his bought with blood money from a war he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. Jonas was a man carved from the same hard wood as the fence posts that lined his property. 42 years old, though, some days he felt twice that with hands that bore the scars of both forge and rifle. His face was weathered leather lined deep around the eyes, from squinting at too many horizons, searching for threats that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. A beard more gray than black now covered the lower half of his face and his eyes. Those eyes had seen things that would make most men drink themselves to death or eat a bullet. He'd done neither. Instead, he'd built this ranch with his own 2 hands kept to himself and tried to find something like peace in the daily rhythm of feeding livestock, mending fences, and watching the seasons turn. The townspeople in Bitter Creek, 12 miles south, called him the Hermit of the North Valley. Jonas didn't mind. He preferred his own company to most folks anyway. The sun was almost gone now, just a thin line of orange fire on the western edge of the world when he saw her. At first he thought it was a deer, or maybe a wounded animal, the way it moved, stumbling, falling, rising again with desperate determination. But as the figure drew closer, weaving between the fence posts that marked the boundary of his land, Jonas felt his hand drift instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. Not an animal. A woman. She was running, no, not running. Running implied some kind of control, some purpose to the motion. This was pure flight, the kind of panicked scrambling that came from being hunted. Her dress, once perhaps a respectable calico print, was torn and darkened with what Jonas recognized immediately as blood. Too much blood. Her feet were bare, leaving small prints in the dust that Jonas could see even from the porch. And clutched against her chest, held with both arms, like a mother holds a child, was a wooden crate. Jesus, Jonas breathed, and then he was moving down the porch steps and across the yard, his long legs covering ground fast. He'd seen wounded soldiers drag themselves for miles. Seen men hold their guts in with one hand while they crawled toward field hospitals. But there was something about the sight of this woman, this stranger, that hit him different. She saw him coming and tried to speak, but only a croak came out. Her legs buckled, and Jonas caught her just before she hit the ground, one arm around her shoulders, the other steadying the crate she refused to release. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much out here, and the word came out harder than he intended. "Easy now. I got you." Up close, he could see she'd taken a hell of a beating. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, already purpling like a storm cloud. Blood matted her blonde hair on one side, and when he shifted his grip, his hand came away sticky and dark. A gash above her ear still bleeding. More blood soaked through the bodice of her dress. Whether hers or someone else's, he couldn't tell. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. The right one, still able to focus, locked onto his face with an intensity that bordered on feral. Terror lived in that eye, but something else too. Determination. Will. The same look he'd seen in cornered animals that knew they were going to die but planned to take a piece of their killer with them. "They killed him," she whispered, and then louder with rising panic. "They killed him. They're coming. They're—" "Who's coming?" Jonas asked, already scanning the darkening prairie behind her. "Who killed who, ma'am? I need you to—" But she was past hearing him. Her good eye rolled back, showing white, and she went limp in his arms, the crate finally slipping from her grasp and hitting the ground with a heavy thunk that spoke of substantial weight. Jonas stood there for a moment, an unconscious woman in his arms, and questions multiplying in his mind like rabbits. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to load her in his wagon, drive her to town, and let Doc Morrison and Sheriff Hartwell deal with whatever trouble she'd brought to his doorstep. That's what a smart man would do. Instead, Jonas Mercer gathered the woman up in his arms, noting how light she was, how the bones of her shoulder pressed against his chest like bird wings, and carried her toward his house. With his boot, he nudged the heavy crate, testing its weight. Solid. Dense. He'd come back for it. The interior of his cabin was Spartan, a necessity born from years of living alone with only his own needs to consider. A table, 2 chairs, optimism, or habit. He'd never decided which, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and his bed in the corner covered with a quilt his mother had made before the war took everything. That quilt was the only soft thing in the entire house, and it was there he laid the stranger as gently as his calloused hands allowed. She moaned when he set her down, a sound that was barely human, more wounded animal than woman. "Easy," he said again, softer this time. "It's all right. You're safe now." Was she safe? Even as he said the words, Jonas knew they might be a lie. Someone had done this to her, someone who might be following. He lit the oil lamp on the bedside table, then moved quickly to his shelves, pulling down supplies he kept for emergencies. Exactly like this, though in truth he'd never had an emergency quite like this one. Clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey half full, a needle and thread already threaded because his eyes weren't what they used to be, and he'd learned to prepare such things in advance. Water from the pump still cold from the deep well. When he returned to the bedside, she was trying to sit up, her one good eye wide with confusion and renewed fear. "Where?" she started, then saw him, and scrambled backward until her back hit the wall, ignoring the way the movement made her wince. "Don't! Please don't!" Jonas stopped holding up his empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you, ma'am. You collapsed at my gate. You're hurt bad, and someone needs to tend those wounds before infection sets in. That someone is me, unless you'd rather I haul you 12 miles to town in the dark." She stared at him, breathing hard, taking his measure. He knew what she saw, a big man broad through the shoulders and chest with scarred hands and a face that would never be called kind. A man who looked like he could break a person in half without much effort because he could, but whatever she saw in his eyes must have satisfied something in her because after a long moment she nodded once. "The crate," she said. "Where's the crate, T?" "Outside. I'll bring it in after I patch you up. Now I need you to let me look at that head wound. It's still bleeding, and head wounds are nothing to play with." She let him approach, but her body stayed coiled tight, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. Jonas moved slowly, telegraphing every motion the way he did with spooked horses. "This is going to hurt," he warned, dampening a cloth with whiskey. "Probably a lot." "Everything already hurts," she said quietly. He started with her face, gently cleaning away the blood and dirt that caked her skin. The gash above her ear was deep, but clean, a blow from something blunt, he guessed. Maybe a rifle stock. The eye would heal on its own, though the bruising would get worse before it got better. As he worked, she started talking. The words came out broken at first, fragments that didn't quite connect, but Jonas stayed quiet and let her find her way to the story. "His name was Henry," she said. "Henry Darnell. We've been married for 3 years, had a small place about 15 miles south of here. Nothing much, just a house and some land he was trying to work. We were going to plant wheat next spring. He said," her voice caught, "he said we were going to make something real out of that place." Jonas threaded the needle, noting the way her hands had started to shake. Shock was setting in. He needed to work faster. "This is going to hurt," he said again, then added what he'd learned from army surgeons years ago. "It'll be over quick." She nodded, closing her eyes, and he began stitching the gash, working with the quick efficiency of a man who'd sewn up more wounds than he cared to remember. She didn't scream, didn't even whimper, just bit down on her lower lip until it bled afresh and gripped the edge of the quilt with white-knuckled hands. They came just before sunset. She continued speaking through clenched teeth. 3 of them. One tall, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, looked like someone had tried to scalp him once and gave up halfway through. Another was short, mean-looking with these little pig eyes that made my skin crawl. The third was young, maybe 19 or 20, but his eyes were old, dead. Jonas tied off the last stitch and began bandaging her head with strips of clean cloth. What did they want? Gold, she said, and laughed a sound with no humor in it. They kept screaming about gold. Where's the gold, Henry? We know you got it. Your brother told us before he died. But we didn't have any gold. We barely had enough to get through the winter. Henry tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen. She was crying now, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. Jonas handed her the whiskey bottle, and she took it, drinking deep, coughing as the liquor burned down her throat. They beat him. She continued, her voice flat now, emotionless, the way people sound when they're describing something so horrible that feeling it would break them completely. Right there in our kitchen, they beat him with the stocks of their rifles. I tried to stop them. I had a cast iron pan. I hit the short one, hit him so hard I thought I'd killed him, but the young one grabbed me, threw me against the wall. I heard Henry screaming, begging them to stop telling them there was no gold, but they just kept hitting him. Jonas moved to check the blood on her dress, his fingers finding the buttons. I need to see if you're hurt anywhere else. She nodded past modesty, now past caring. As he opened her dress, he found more bruises blooming across her ribs, some already dark purple, others still red and angry, probably cracked ribs, maybe broken, but no puncture wounds, no arterial bleeding. She'd been beaten, not stabbed. Small mercy. The tall one with the scar, he pulled out a knife, she said, staring at the ceiling, now seeing something Jonas couldn't see. He told Henry he was going to cut the information out of him piece by piece, start with fingers, move up to hands, then arms. He said he'd done it before in the war, said he knew exactly how much a man could lose before he died. Jonas felt something cold settle in his gut. He knew men like that, had served with some of them, killed others, men who'd found something broken in themselves during the war and decided to keep using it after the peace came. Henry looked at me, she continued, just looked at me, and I knew. I knew he was telling me to run. So when they grabbed him, when they dragged him toward the bedroom where they thought we'd hidden the gold, I ran, crashed right through the front window. I don't even remember grabbing the crate, but suddenly it was in my arms and I was running. What's in the crate? Jonas asked. I don't know, she said. I don't know. It was under our bed. Henry kept it locked, said it was private, and I never pushed. But it was the only thing I grabbed, the only thing I took when I ran. Jonas finished his examination, noting with relief that while she was badly hurt, nothing seemed life-threatening. The head wound was the worst of it, and he'd seen men walk around with worse. Your name, he said. I should know your name if I'm going to help you. Clara, she said. Clara Darnell. Then after a pause, who are you? Jonas Mercer. This is my land. Thank you, she said, for helping me. For not... She trailed off, but he understood. I'll get your crate. No, he said, standing. Then we need to decide what to do next. He stepped outside and the night hit him like a wall. Full dark now. The moon not yet risen, just stars scattered across the black like someone had thrown diamonds at velvet. The crate sat where it had fallen, and Jonas knelt beside it, running his hands over the wood. It was old, the kind of box men used to store valuables, maybe 2 feet long, a foot wide, a foot deep. The wood was dark with age and something else. Jonas lifted it, felt the substantial weight, heard something shift inside. Heavy, dense. The lock was old too, a thick iron mechanism that had been built to last. He was carrying it back toward the house when he heard it, the distant sound of hooves on hard earth. Multiple horses moving fast. Jonas froze, every sense suddenly sharp. From inside the cabin, he heard Clara's voice, high and terrified. Do you hear that? Oh God, do you hear that? They're coming. They found me. He moved quickly back inside, setting the crate down harder than he intended. Clara was trying to stand, swaying dangerously, her face sheet white beneath the bruises. How many he asked. 3, the same 3. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. You have to hide me, please. They'll kill you if they find me here. They'll kill us both. Jonas could hear them clearly now, the thunder of hooves getting closer. Maybe 5 minutes out, maybe less. His mind was already working, calculating angles and possibilities, the way he'd learned to do when survival meant being faster and smarter than the other fellow. "Can you move?" he asked. "I think so." "Where? Come with me. Quickly now." He grabbed the oil lamp and led her to the corner of the room where a threadbare rug covered the floor. With his boot, he kicked the rug aside, revealing what looked like solid floorboards. But when he knelt and worked his fingers into a notch invisible, unless you knew where to look, a section of floor lifted up, revealing a dark space beneath. "Down," he said. "Now." Clara stared into the darkness. "What is that?" "Hiding hole. Built it during the war, back when folks were still worried about Confederate raids this far north. Haven't used it in years, but it's solid. Big enough for you and the crate both." "You're coming with me." "No, ma'am. I'm going to do what any rancher would do when 3 riders show up at his door after dark. I'm going to greet them with a rifle and ask them their business. They'll kill you. They might try." The hooves were closer now, maybe 2 minutes. Jonas could pick out individual horses, could hear men's voices calling to each other. "Please," Clara said, "don't do this. Just hide with me. Let them think nobody's home." But Jonas was already moving, helping her down into the hole despite her protests. It was deeper than it looked, maybe 6 feet down, with enough room for a person to sit or crouch comfortably. During the war, he'd hidden supplies down here, ammunition, food documents he didn't want found. Now it smelled of dust and old earth and memories. "The crate," Clara said. "Give me the crate." He lowered it down to her, heard her grunt as she took the weight. Then he looked down at her upturned face, pale in the lamplight, terrified but determined. "Whatever happens," he said, "you stay down here. You hear shooting, you stay down. You hear nothing for hours, you stay down. When it's safe, when you're sure it's safe, there's a trap door in the back wall that leads to the root cellar. From there you can get out to the barn. You understand?" "Jonas, do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered. He lowered the floor section, plunging her into darkness, then quickly spread the rug back over the boards. To a casual eye, nothing looked disturbed. You'd have to know the hiding hole was there to find it. The riders were at his gate now. He could hear them whooping and hollering, could hear one of them firing a pistol into the air. 3 men, like Clara said, drunk on violence and maybe whiskey too from the sound of them. Jonas moved to the gun rack mounted beside the door. He had 3 rifles, an old Springfield from the war, a newer Winchester, and a Henry repeater that had cost him a small fortune but was worth every penny for the 16 rounds it held. He chose the Henry, checking the load with practiced efficiency, then grabbed a bandolier of ammunition and slung it across his chest. Through the window, he could see them now, silhouettes against the starlight. 3 riders spread out across his yard like they owned it. The tallest one had to be the man with the scar, was in the middle, sitting his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. To his left, a shorter figure, squat and mean-looking even at a distance. To his right, someone younger, slimmer, moving with the nervous energy of youth and too much violence. Jonas took a breath, centered himself the way his father had taught him before the old man died, and stepped out onto his porch. The night air was cool against his skin, and somewhere in the distance he could hear a coyote singing its lonely song. For a moment nobody moved. Jonas stood on his porch with the rifle cradled in his arms, not pointing at anyone but not exactly pointing away either. The 3 riders sat their horses studying him with the kind of attention predators give potential prey. Then the tall one laughed, a sound like gravel sliding down a metal chute. "Well now," he called out, "look what we got here, boys. A genuine hermit, all alone in his castle." Jonas said nothing, just waited. Patience was a weapon too, if you knew how to use it. The short one spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We're looking for something, mister. Something that belongs to us. You seen a woman come through here, blonde hair, pretty thing, though probably not looking so pretty right about now." "Haven't seen anyone," Jonas said, his voice carrying across the yard without him having to shout. "Just me out here. Been just me for a long time." The young one in Clara was right. His eyes were wrong, too old for his face, nudged his horse forward a few steps. "That's funny, old man, 'cause we've been tracking her, and her tracks lead right to your gate, right to your fucking gate." "Well, language," Jonas said mildly. I don't allow cursing on my property. The tall one laughed again. You hear that, boys. He don't allow cursing. He leaned forward in his saddle, and even in the starlight, Jonas could see the scar Clara had described, a thick rope of tissue running from the man's left eye down to his jaw. Tell you what, friend, you hand over the woman and we'll be on our way. No trouble, no fuss. You don't, and we're going to tear this place apart looking for her. And if we find her when we find her, we're going to hurt you bad for lying to us. Jonas felt something old and familiar stir in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd gotten right before battles during the war, a kind of cold clarity that made everything sharp and simple. Violence was coming. The only question was who would survive it. Like I said, Jonas replied, haven't seen any woman. Now it's late and I got work to do in the morning. I'm going to have to ask you boys to clear off my land. Ask? The short one had dismounted, now his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. You're asking for now. The three men exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Then as one, they started moving. The tall one still mounted the short one on foot, and the young one circling around to the right, trying to flank the house. Jonas tracked the movement with his eyes, but didn't shift the rifle. Not yet. Last chance, old man, the tall one said. The woman. Now. She ain't here, Jonas said, and for the first time since they'd arrived, he brought the Henry rifle up to his shoulder, the barrel now pointed directly at the tall man's chest. But you're welcome to check with the devil when you get to hell. For a long moment, nobody moved. The night held its breath. Then the short one went for his gun, and the world exploded into fire and thunder. Jonas had aimed at the tall one because he was clearly the leader, but he adjusted mid-motion as he saw the short man's hand blur toward his pistol. Training took over hours and hours of drilling during the war muscle memory that never quite faded, and Jonas's first shot took the short man in the chest before his gun had cleared leather. The impact knocked him backward into the dirt where he lay still. The tall man was moving too, yanking a rifle from his saddle scabbard, but his horse, spooked by the gunfire, reared up, throwing off his aim. Jonas levered another round into the chamber and fired again this time, clipping the tall man's shoulder and spinning him half out of his saddle. The young one had his pistol out now, firing wildly from horseback, and Jonas felt something hot kiss his upper arm, close, too close. He dove off the porch, rolling to his right, coming up behind the water trough. Two more shots punched through the wooden slats above his head, spraying him with splinters. You son of a bitch! The tall man was screaming, blood streaming down his arm as he fought to control his panicking horse. Kill him! Kill that son of a bitch! The young one was circling, trying to get an angle on Jonas behind the trough. Jonas counted shots 3 fired, which meant the kid likely had 3 or 4 rounds left, depending on whether he'd loaded 6 or 5 in his cylinder. Enough to be dangerous. Jonas risked a look around the edge of the trough and saw the kid lining up a shot. He ducked back just as the bullet slammed into the wood where his head had been. Splinters bit into his cheek, drawing blood. Think like the soldier you used to be. The forge. His workshop was 20 feet to the left, and inside was a window that overlooked the yard from a different angle. If he could get there, Jonas broke from cover, sprinting low and fast, the Henry rifle clutched tight against his chest. Behind him he heard the kid shout, heard the tall man bellowing orders, heard more shots crack through the night. Something tugged at his pants leg, another near miss, and then he was crashing through the workshop door, stumbling over an anvil in the darkness. The workshop smelled of coal smoke and hot metal, familiar and comforting even now. Jonas moved to the window, cracked it open just enough to rest the rifle barrel on the sill, and took aim. The young one had dismounted, was moving toward the house with his pistol extended, clearly expecting Jonas to be behind the trough still. Amateur mistake. Jonas let him take 3 more steps, centered the rifle sight on the kid's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The Henry roared. The young one stumbled, looked down at the bloom of red spreading across his shirt, with an expression of almost comical surprise, and then collapsed face first into the dirt. No! The tall man had finally gotten his horse under control, and now charged toward the workshop, his rifle barking flame and thunder. Jonas ducked as bullets punched through the thin wood walls, showering him with splinters and wood dust. One round hit the anvil with a shower of sparks and a scream of tortured metal. Jonas rolled toward the back door, came up firing. Once, twice, 3 times. The first 2 shots went wild, but the third caught the tall man's horse in the chest. The animal went down hard, pinning the rider's leg beneath its bulk. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the tall man's cursing and the dying horse's labored breathing. Jonas stepped out of the workshop, the Henry rifle trained on the trapped rider. "Please," the tall man gasped, trying to free his leg. "Please, my leg's broke. I need help." Jonas walked closer, his boots crunching on the blood-soaked earth. Around him, the evidence of violence: 2 bodies, 1 dying horse, spent brass casings glinting in the starlight. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the copper tang of blood. "The woman?" Jonas said quietly. "Why?" The tall man looked up at him, and in his eyes, Jonas saw fear mixing with hatred. "Go to hell." "You first." Jonas knelt beside the dying horse and put a mercy bullet through its brain. The animal shuddered once and went still. Then he turned his attention to the pinned rider. "I'll ask one more time," Jonas said. "Why were you after her?" "Gold," the man spat. "Her husband had gold. His brother told us before we killed him. Said Henry Darnell had found a whole cache of it, hidden it somewhere. We were going to make them tell us where." "Was there gold?" "How the fuck should I know?" "We never got the chance to find out. The bastard wouldn't talk, just kept saying there wasn't any gold, and then she ran." He grimaced as he tried to shift his trapped leg. "We weren't going to kill them, just persuade them a little, make them see reason." Jonas looked at the man's face, at the scar tissue and the cold eyes, and knew he was lying. These men had come to torture and kill. Clara and her husband had just been in the way of what they wanted. "Where's the gold?" the tall man asked suddenly. "You got it, don't you? That's why you're protecting her. You want it for yourself." Jonas stood working the lever action on the Henry to chamber another round. The mechanical sound was loud in the sudden quiet. "Wait," the man said, reading something in Jonas's face. "Wait. We can make a deal. Split the gold 3 ways, just you and me now. We find it, split it, nobody has to know. Come on, be reasonable. Be—" "Your friends," Jonas interrupted. "They have families. Anyone who'll come looking for them." Why does that matter?" "It matters. The kid, maybe. His daddy runs a spread about 30 miles south, but he's a drunk, barely knows his own name half the time. Won't care the boy's gone." Jonas nodded slowly. "And the short one? Drifter. No one. He was nobody before we met him, nobody after." The man's eyes narrowed. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because," Jonas said quietly, "I'm trying to decide what kind of man you are, whether you deserve quick or slow. You can't just— I'm pinned. I can't even defend myself. You can't just murder a helpless man." "Helpless," Jonas repeated. "Like Clara Darnell was helpless, like her husband." The tall man opened his mouth to respond, and Jonas saw the calculation in his eyes, saw him weighing lies and truths, and whatever might save his life. But before he could speak, Jonas heard a sound from the direction of the house, a board creaking. His head snapped around, and there in the doorway stood Clara. She'd climbed out of the hiding hole. The bandage around her head was already seeping red, and she swayed on her feet like a tree in a strong wind. But her eyes were clear, fixed on the trapped man with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. "You?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The tall man started laughing, a wet sound that suggested internal bleeding. "There she is! There's our girl! Come to watch honey! Come to see what happens when you run!" Clara walked forward each step, looking like it cost her. In her hand she held something Jonas hadn't noticed before, a pistol. His pistol, he realized, the old Colt Navy revolver he kept in a drawer by his bed. She must have found it when she was looking for the crate. "Clara," Jonas said carefully. "Clara, you need to go back inside." "He killed Henry," she said, still walking forward. "I watched him do it. He beat him until there wasn't anything left to beat. And then he kept going. He laughed. He laughed while he did it." The tall man had stopped laughing now. "Now wait a minute. Wait just a minute. It wasn't like that. Your husband, he attacked us. We were just defending ourselves. It was self-defense, pure and simple." Clara raised the pistol, both hands wrapped around the grip, the barrel shaking but pointed more or less at the trapped man's head. "No," the man said, real fear in his voice now. No, you can't. You're not a killer. I can see it in your eyes. You're not like us. You couldn't. You're right, Clara said softly. I'm not a killer. She pulled back the hammer with a click that seemed loud as thunder. But I'm not nothing either. Clara? Jonas took a step toward her. You don't want to do this. He killed my husband. He beat Henry to death in our kitchen. He was going to do worse to me. I know what he did. But if you pull that trigger, you're going to have to live with it. Forever. It's going to change you in ways you can't imagine right now. I'm already changed, she said, and Jonas heard the truth of it in her voice. I already watched my husband die. I already ran through the dark with killers on my heels. I'm already covered in blood, his blood, their blood, my blood. What's one more change? The tall man was begging now, words tumbling over each other. Please, please, I have money. I have connections. I can make you rich. I can make you both rich. Just let me go. You can't make me anything, Clara interrupted, because you're already dead. You just haven't figured it out yet. She pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. Click. Clara stared at the gun in confusion, pulled the trigger again. Click. Again. Click. The cylinder rotated, showing empty chambers, and Jonas realized with a sick lurch that he'd never reloaded the damn thing after shooting targets last month. The tall man started laughing again, relief and hysteria mixing in equal measure. Can't even kill a trapped man, can't even... Jonas raised the Henry rifle and fired once. The tall man's laughter cut off mid-sound as the bullet punched through his chest dead center. He slumped forward over the dead horse's neck and went still. For a long moment, nobody moved. The gunshot echoed across the valley, fading into the night. Clara stood frozen, the empty pistol still raised, still pointed at where the man had been alive a moment before. Why? She asked. Finally, turning to look at Jonas. Why did you do that? Because it needed doing, Jonas said simply, and because you've already lost enough. You didn't need that on your conscience, too. The pistol slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers, hitting the dirt with a thud. Then her legs gave out, and Jonas was there to catch her before she hit the ground, the same way he'd caught her at the gate what felt like a lifetime ago but had been less than 2 hours. It's done, he said, holding her as she shook. Not crying. She was past crying, just shaking like she was cold even though the night was warm. It's done. Almost. Almost, she asked. We still need to bury them and figure out what to do next. I want to see the crate, Clara said. I want to know what Henry died for. Jonas helped her back to the house, past the bodies cooling in the yard, past the blood-soaked earth and the spent shells. Inside, she sank into one of his chairs while he retrieved the crate from the hiding hole, setting it on the table between them. The lock was old but solid. Jonas studied it for a moment, then went to his workshop and returned with a heavy chisel and hammer. 3 solid blows, and the lock mechanism shattered. Clara reached out with shaking hands and lifted the lid. For a long moment, she just stared. Then she started laughing. Not the hysterical laughter of earlier, but something darker, more bitter. Look at it, she said. Just look at it. Jonas looked. The crate was filled to the brim with gold coins. Not paper money, not promises or hopes or dreams. Real gold. Double eagles and half eagles gleaming in the lamplight like captured sunshine. More gold than Jonas had ever seen in one place. He wasn't lying, Clara whispered. All this time they said he was lying, but he wasn't. He was telling the truth. She picked up a coin, turned it over in her fingers. His brother must have left it for us. Must have hidden it under our bed before he died. And Henry never even looked. He never even knew it was there. How much do you think? Jonas started. Enough, Clara interrupted. Enough to start over. Enough to buy a new life somewhere far from here. Enough to... She trailed off, staring at the gold. Enough to make 3 men kill for it. Jonas closed the lid gently. Clara, we need to talk about what happens next. She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered in her eyes. But it was a cautious hope, a careful hope, the hope of someone who'd learned that good things can be taken away in an instant. What do you mean? I mean, there's 3 dead men in my yard, and come morning, someone's going to notice they're missing. That kid's father, drunk or not, is eventually going to ask questions. The law might come asking, And you're in no shape to run. You need time to heal, time to figure out your next move. Are you saying I should leave? Jonas hesitated. The smart thing would be to say yes, to send her on her way with the gold and whatever trouble came with it. He'd lived alone for years, preferred it that way. Hadn't he? But then he thought about how she'd looked standing in his doorway trying to face down her husband's killer, despite barely being able to stand. Thought about the determination in her voice, the strength it had taken to run 15 miles with killers on her heels. Thought about how light she'd felt in his arms, like something precious and breakable that needed protecting. No, he heard himself say. No, I'm saying you should stay, at least for a while, until you're healed, until you can think straight and make plans that aren't just running away. Why would you do that? Clara asked. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Jonas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd lost everything in a single night, but was still fighting, still trying to survive. He saw someone who reminded him of himself 10 years ago when he'd come back from the war with nothing but nightmares and the clothes on his back. Because, he said slowly, I know what it's like to lose everything, and I know what it's like to have no one. And I'm thinking maybe, he paused, searching for the right words, maybe we've both been alone long enough. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the eaves of the house. Somewhere in the darkness, that coyote was still singing. There's something else, Jonas said. Something I need to tell you before you decide. What? The war. I did things during the war, bad things, things I'm not proud of. I followed orders, and sometimes those orders were... He stopped, unable to continue. Were what? Were the kind of orders that keep a man awake at night, that make him wonder if he's still human or if he left that part of himself on some battlefield. Claire reached across the table and took his scarred hand in her smaller one. I watched my husband beaten to death tonight. I ran for my life. I tried to kill a helpless man. I think we're both learning that survival doesn't leave much room for being who we used to be. Jonas felt something in his chest crack just a little. A wall he'd built brick by careful brick over 10 years of isolation and self-imposed penance. Not breaking, not yet, but developing a fracture that might, given time, let light through. In the morning, he said, we'll bury them deep, out past the north pasture where the ground's soft. Then we'll burn their saddles, their gear, anything that might connect them to this place. Their horses will run off. They'll find their way to someone eventually. And then we figure out what comes next, together. Clara nodded slowly. Kate, Jonas. Yes. Thank you for saving my life, for... She gestured vaguely at the room, the bandage on her head, the crate of gold, the bodies outside. For all of it. You're welcome, Clara Darnell. Now come on, let's get you back to bed. You're dead on your feet. He helped her to the bed, and she collapsed onto it like a puppet with cut strings. Within moments, her breathing had evened out into sleep, the sleep of the utterly exhausted. Jonas stood watching her for a moment, this stranger who'd fallen into his life with violence and blood and a mysterious crate of gold. Then he turned and walked back outside where 3 dead men waited in the darkness. The night was wearing on toward dawn, and he had work to do. Bodies to move evidence, to hide questions, to prepare answers for. The kind of work he'd hoped to never do again. But as he dragged the first body toward his wagon, Jonas found himself thinking not about what he'd lost by letting Clara Darnell into his life, but about what he might have gained. Company, purpose, maybe even something like redemption. The stars wheeled overhead, marking time in their patient way, and Jonas Mercer worked through the night doing what needed doing, because that's what survivors did. They did what needed doing, and they kept moving forward one step at a time until the darkness gave way to dawn and another day of chances. The first light of dawn found Jonas knee-deep in Montana earth, his shovel biting into soil that had seen too much blood in one night. Behind him, 3 bodies lay wrapped in canvas tarp, anonymous bundles that had been men with names and histories just hours before. Now they were nothing but weight and evidence problems to be solved before the sun climbed high enough for neighbors to come visiting. Clara had woken once during the night, screaming Henry's name into the darkness. Jonas had gone to her, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead until the nightmare released its grip and she fell back into fitful sleep. He'd watched her breathing even out, memorizing the way morning light would soon paint shadows across her bruised face, then return to his grim work. The hole he dug was deeper than it needed to be, 8 feet down into earth that smelled of clay and ancient water. Deep enough that coyotes and wolves wouldn't catch the scent, deep enough that spring rains wouldn't uncover what he was burying. He'd learned these lessons during the war, learned them in places where the dead outnumbered the living, and proper burial was a luxury nobody could afford. Need help. Jonas turned to find Clara standing at the edge of the pasture, wrapped in his spare coat against the morning chill. She looked like Death's younger sister, pale as moonlight, the bandage around her head already showing red seepage, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose ribs screamed with every breath. "You should be in bed," Jonas said, driving the shovel into the dirt pile. "I've been in bed. Couldn't sleep anymore. Too many dreams." She walked closer, wobbling slightly, and Jonas resisted the urge to catch her. She needed to find her own balance now. "How deep are you going?" "Deep enough." "You've done this before." It wasn't a question, but Jonas answered anyway. "During the war, we had burial details after every battle. Sometimes we'd dig for days." He wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. "You learn to dig deep, dig fast, and try not to think about what you're putting in the ground." Clara stared at the wrapped bodies. "Do you think they had families? People who loved them?" The tall one said the kid's father might notice he's gone. The other two, probably nobody. Jonas climbed out of the hole, his muscles aching from hours of labor. "Does it matter?" "I don't know. Maybe. They were someone's sons once, someone's babies, and now they're—" She gestured at the bundles. "This. They made their choices." Jonas said, his voice harder than he intended. "They beat your husband to death. They were coming to do worse to you. Don't waste your grief on men like that." "I'm not grieving them," Clara said quietly. "I'm grieving the world where things like this happen. Where men can beat someone to death over gold that wasn't even there. Where women have to run through the dark, clutching wooden boxes and hoping they live until sunrise." She looked at Jonas with those bruised, burning eyes. "Where good men have to become killers again just to keep monsters at bay." Jonas felt those words land somewhere deep in his chest, in that cracked place that had started opening the night before. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't a good man, that whatever goodness had lived in him had been burned out by war and isolation. But the words wouldn't come, so he just nodded and reached for the first body. Together, working in silence, they lowered the dead into their unmarked grave. The tall one with his scar. The short, mean-looking one. The kid with old eyes who'd never get any older. Jonas tried not to think about their last moments. The tall one begging the kid, looking surprised at the red spreading across his shirt. Just bodies now. Just problem solved. When all three were at the bottom of the hole, Jonas started shoveling dirt back in. Clara stood watching, her arms wrapped around herself, and Jonas wondered what she was thinking. Was she seeing her husband in that hole? Seeing herself. Seeing the life she'd had before violence came knocking. "Tell me about Henry," Jonas said, partly because he wanted to know, and partly because the silence was becoming oppressive, weighted with ghosts. "What kind of man was he?" Clara was quiet for so long Jonas thought she wouldn't answer. Then, kind. He was kind, which seems like such a small thing to say about someone, but it's not. Kindness is rare. Real kindness, not the performance kind that people do to look good. She picked up a handful of dirt, let it sift through her fingers. He found a bird once, a baby robin, that had fallen from its nest. Spent 3 days feeding it with an eyedropper, keeping it warm, trying to save it. When it died anyway, he cried. 30-year-old man crying over a bird. Jonas kept shoveling, letting her talk. "He wasn't strong like you," Clara continued. "Wasn't a fighter. When those men came, he tried to protect me with words, tried to reason with them. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out what combination of words would make them leave us alone. But there weren't any words. Some men don't listen to anything but violence." "I'm sorry," Jonas said, and meant it. "Are you sorry, or are you just saying what people say?" Jonas stopped shoveling, met her eyes. "I'm sorry that the world is the kind of place where good men die for no reason, while bastards thrive. I'm sorry that you had to watch it happen. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to you sooner, couldn't stop it from happening at all. That's sorry enough for you?" Clara's expression softened slightly. Yes, yes, that's sorry enough." The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist that had settled in the valley. Jonas could hear his cattle lowing in the distance, confused that he hadn't come to feed them yet. Normal sounds of a normal day, except nothing about this day was normal or ever would be again. By the time the grave was filled and the earth tamped down, Jonas's shoulders were screaming and his hands had developed fresh blisters on top of old calluses. He stood back studying his work with a critical eye. You couldn't tell anything had been disturbed unless you were looking for it, and even then you'd have to know what to look for. "Should we say something?" Clara asked. "Some kind of prayer or—" "No?" Jonas interrupted. "They don't deserve prayers. And God stopped listening to me a long time ago anyway." They walked back to the house in silence, and Jonas was acutely aware of Clara beside him, the way she moved, the effort it cost her to keep pace. She was tough. He'd give her that. Most women, most men, for that matter, would still be in bed whimpering after what she'd been through. But here she was, helping bury the men who'd killed her husband. Back at the house, Jonas dealt with the horses while Clara sat on the porch steps watching. 3 good animals, well-trained and worth decent money, but keeping them would raise questions. He removed their saddles and tack, stripped them of anything that might identify their previous owners, then smacked the lead horse on the rump and watched them gallop off across the prairie. They'd find water, find other horses, maybe find their way to someone's ranch. Or maybe they'd die out there. Either way, they were no longer his problem. The saddles and gear he piled in the forge, adding coal and working the bellows until the fire roared hot enough to melt metal. Leather burned with an acrid smell that made Clara cover her nose. But Jonas just kept feeding the flames, watching years of careful craftsmanship reduce to ash and smoke. Waste, but necessary waste. When the last traces of the dead men's belongings had been consumed, Jonas damped down the forge and found Clara had moved inside, was sitting at his table with the crate open before her, running her fingers through the gold coins like they were water. "There's more than I thought," she said without looking up. "I counted while you were burning their things, $17,000 in gold. Maybe more. Some of these coins are older, might be worth more than face value to collectors." Jonas whistled low. "That's a fortune. Enough to buy a whole new life somewhere. Enough to kill for, apparently." Clara closed the lid with a decisive snap. "Henry's brother, I barely knew him. He came through once about 6 months after we were married. Stayed 2 days, talked about heading west to the goldfields, then left. We never heard from him again. I thought he died out there, thought that was the end of it." "Maybe he struck it rich, Doug," Jonas said, pouring coffee from the pot that had been staying warm by the fire. "Maybe he wanted to share it with family. Maybe he hid it under your bed and planned to come back for it. Or maybe he stole it," Clara said flatly. "Maybe he robbed someone, killed someone for it, and hid it the only place he could think of. And maybe the people he stole it from tracked him down, tortured the location out of him before they killed him. And maybe that's why those 3 came to our house with murder in their eyes." Jonas set a cup of coffee in front of her. "Does it matter? Where it came from, I mean. I don't know. Does it?" Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. "If this gold is stolen, if people died for it before Henry, are we any better than those 3 out there if we keep it? We didn't kill for it. They did. You were going to be the next victims, and I stopped that from happening. As far as I'm concerned, that gold is yours by right of survival." Jonas sat down across from her. "But if you want to try returning it, try finding out where it came from, we can do that. Though I'll tell you right now, it won't be easy, and it might be dangerous." Clara sipped her coffee, wincing as the hot liquid touched a split lip Jonas hadn't noticed before. "I keep thinking about what you said last night, about how survival doesn't leave much room for being who we used to be. Maybe you're right. Maybe Clara Darnell, the woman who lived in that little house with her kind husband and her plans for wheat fields, maybe that woman died yesterday. And the person sitting here now is someone else. Someone who needs to be practical about things like blood money and unmarked graves." "That's a dark road to walk down," Jonas said carefully. "Is it darker than the one where I pretend none of this happened, where I try to go back to being innocent and good while carrying $17,000 in gold that cost my husband his life? Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. I think that ship sailed right around the time I pulled a trigger on a helpless man, even if the gun was empty. Jonas didn't have an answer for that, so he just drank his coffee and watched her think. Outside, the day was heating up, promising the kind of weather that made horses lazy and men seek shade. A normal day on a normal ranch, except for the fresh grave in the north pasture and the fortune in gold sitting on the kitchen table. "There's something I need to know," Clara said finally. "Why did you help me?" "Really? You could have turned me away, could have told those men you hadn't seen me, could have stayed safe and alone like you've been for years. So why risk everything for a stranger?" Jonas thought about that question, turned it over in his mind like one of those gold coins. Why had he helped her? The easy answer was that it was the right thing to do, but Jonas had seen enough of the world to know that most people didn't do the right thing when it cost them something. So why had he... During the war, he said slowly, "I saw a lot of terrible things. Did some terrible things too, orders or not? And after it was over, I came out here thinking I'd find some kind of peace, some kind of forgetting. But you can't forget. Not really. The things you've done, the things you've seen, they're always there, waiting in the dark." He paused, refilled his coffee cup with hands that were steadier than they should have been. "A few years back, maybe 5 or 6, there was a family passing through. Wagon broke down about 2 miles from here. Husband, wife, 3 kids. I heard them from my porch, heard the wife crying, the kids scared. And you know what I did?" Clara shook her head. "Nothing. I sat on my porch and listened to them fix their wagon and move on, and I didn't lift a finger to help. Told myself it wasn't my business, told myself I'd earned the right to be left alone. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about those kids scared and cold and their father trying to fix a wagon in the dark while I sat in my warm house doing nothing." Jonas met Clara's eyes across the table. "When you collapsed at my gate, I heard that family again, heard those kids crying. And I thought maybe this is it. Maybe this is the chance to not be the man who does nothing. Maybe I can be someone better, even if it's just for one night." "One night turned into a lot more than that," Clara observed. Yeah, it did." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the house settle around them. It was Clara who finally spoke. "I can't go back to my house. Can't face going through Henry's things. Can't sleep in the bed where we..." She stopped, swallowed hard. "Can't be in the place where he died. Does that make me a coward?" "Makes you human," Jonas said. "But you're going to need clothes, supplies, documents if you have them. Marriage license, birth records, anything legal. We kept papers in a tin box in the pantry. If it survived, if those men didn't destroy everything looking for gold." She trailed off, then straightened her spine like she was preparing for battle. "We should go, today. Get it over with. You're in no shape to ride. I'm in no shape to do a lot of things, but they need doing anyway. Besides, the longer we wait, the more likely someone stumbles across what's left of the house. I'd rather get there first." Jonas couldn't argue with that logic, so he didn't try. Instead, he hitched up his wagon, the same wagon he'd considered putting Clara in last night, to take her to town and helped her onto the seat. She moved like a woman twice her age, every motion careful and calculated to minimize pain. The bandage around her head needed changing, but that could wait until they got back. The ride to the Darnell place took just over an hour, following wagon ruts through grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Jonas kept his rifle across his lap and his eyes on the distance, watching for riders or trouble. But the prairie remained empty except for the occasional antelope and a hawk that circled overhead like it was keeping watch. Clara got quieter the closer they got, her hands twisting in her lap, her breathing shallow. Jonas wanted to say something comforting, but didn't know what, so he just drove and let her have her silence. The house appeared first as a dark spot against the golden grass, then resolved into details that made Jonas's jaw tighten. The front window Clara had crashed through was a jagged mouth of broken glass. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze, and even from a distance, Jonas could see the destruction the 3 men had wrought in their search for gold. "Oh, God," Clara whispered. "Oh, God, Henry." Jonas brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house, but didn't immediately dismount. He studied the scene with a soldier's eye, looking for signs of recent activity, for evidence that someone else had been here since last night. But there was nothing. just a violated house sitting alone under a merciless sun. "You don't have to go in," Jonas said. "I can get what you need." "No," Clara said, her voice stronger than it had been. "No, I need to do this. Need to say goodbye properly." She climbed down from the wagon before Jonas could help her, stumbling slightly, but catching herself. Then she walked toward the house like she was walking toward a gallows, each step an act of will. Jonas followed, rifle in hand, though he wasn't sure what threat he was guarding against. The dead memories. Sometimes they were the same thing. The interior of the house looked like a tornado had touched down in the middle of it. Furniture, overturned dishes, smashed floorboards, pried up where the men had searched for hidden gold. The kitchen where Clara had said Henry died was the worst. Blood everywhere, dried to brown, now painting the walls and floor in patterns that told the story of violence. Jonas had seen enough battlefields to read those patterns like a book. Henry Darnell had died hard fighting until the end, refusing to give up information he didn't have. Clara stood in the doorway swaying, and Jonas thought she might faint. But she didn't. Instead, she walked into that kitchen like she was walking into church, her steps reverent and slow. "He's not here," she said, and there was confusion in her voice. "The body. Henry's body. It's not here." Jonas had noticed that too. Blood, yes. Signs of death, absolutely. But no corpse. Maybe they moved him. Hid him somewhere. Why would they do that? I don't know. Clara's face crumpled. I can't bury him if I can't find him. Can't say proper words over his grave. Can't... She pressed her hands to her mouth, and Jonas heard a sound come from her that was beyond crying, beyond grief. It was the sound of something breaking that couldn't be fixed. He went to her, put his arms around her, and let her collapse against his chest. She didn't weep. It was like she was past weeping, just shook silently while he held her in that blood-painted kitchen where her husband had died. We'll find him, Jonas said into her hair. I promise you, Clara. We'll find him and bury him proper. How he could be anywhere. They could have thrown him in a ravine, left him for the coyotes, burned him, anything. Then we search. We search until we find him, or until we've looked everywhere there is to look. Jonas pulled back enough to see her face. But right now we need to get what you came for. Papers, clothes, anything you need. Can you do that? Clara nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. The tin box. It's in the pantry, or it was. The pantry was a small room off the kitchen, and miraculously, it had escaped the worst of the destruction. The tin box sat on a shelf exactly where Clara had said it would be, covered in a fine layer of flour from a bag that had been torn open and emptied on the floor. Jonas retrieved the box and handed it to Clara, who opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were documents, a marriage license, a deed to the property letters tied with string, a small leather journal. Clara clutched the box to her chest like she'd clutched the crate of gold the night before. His handwriting, she said. The journal. He wrote in it every day, kept track of weather and planting and his plans for the farm. His handwriting is in there, and that's something. They spent the next 30 minutes gathering what they could salvage. Clothes for Clara, a few dresses that hadn't been destroyed, undergarments, a coat for when winter came, a photograph in a frame cracked but intact showing Clara and Henry on their wedding day, both of them young and smiling and ignorant of what the future held. A few books, a sewing kit, a hairbrush. It wasn't much. A whole life reduced to what could fit in the back of a wagon. But it was hers, and Jonas helped her load it all carefully, treating each item with the respect it deserved. As they were finishing, Jonas noticed something that made him pause. Boot prints in the blood leading from the kitchen toward the back of the house. He followed them, Clara trailing behind until they reached the small bedroom. The bed had been torn apart, mattress slashed open, feathers everywhere. But that wasn't what caught Jonas's attention. It was the drag marks on the floor leading to the window. They took him out the window, Jonas said, studying the pattern. After they killed him, they dragged him out the back window. Why would they do that? Clara had gone pale. To hide him, to prevent someone from finding him and raising an alarm before they could catch me. Maybe. Or maybe... Jonas leaned out the window, looking at the ground below. More drag marks leading away from the house toward a small rise about 100 yards distant. Stay here. Jonas, don't... But he was already moving, climbing through the window and following the trail. Behind him, he heard Clara calling his name, heard her struggling to climb through after him, but he didn't stop. The drag marks were clear in the soft earth, 2 parallel lines where heels had scored the ground. The rise was topped with a single scraggly tree, and it was there in the shade of that tree that Jonas found Henry Darnell. They'd left him on his back arms at his sides, almost peaceful, except for the ruin they'd made of his face and body. Someone, probably the tall one, had even closed his eyes, a gesture of mercy that seemed obscene given what they'd done to him. Jonas heard Clara behind him, heard her sharp intake of breath, but he didn't turn around. Just stood looking at the body of a man he'd never met, a kind man who'd cried over a bird, who'd tried to reason with monsters, who'd died protecting information he didn't have. "Henry," Clara breathed, and then she was pushing past Jonas, falling to her knees beside her husband's body. Her hands hovered over him, wanting to touch, but afraid to, like he might break apart under her fingers. "I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry I ran. I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry I couldn't save you." Jonas watched her grieve, feeling like an intruder on something private and sacred. But when she started trying to lift Henry's body, trying to move him with arms that could barely lift themselves, he stepped in. "Let me," he said gently. "Clara, let me." Together they carried Henry Darnell to the wagon. Jonas fetched a blanket from the house and wrapped the body with as much dignity as he could manage, then secured it in the wagon bed. Clara sat beside her husband's body, her hand resting on the blanket, and didn't move or speak for the entire ride back to Jonas's ranch. The sun was beginning its descent when they arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Jonas uncomfortably of fire and blood. He helped Clara down from the wagon, but she shook her head when he moved toward Henry's body. "Not yet," she said. "Not in the dark. Tomorrow. We'll bury him tomorrow in the daylight so I can see where I'm putting him." Jonas didn't argue. Instead, he covered the wagon with canvas and left it in the barn away from scavengers. Then he guided Clara back to the house, where she collapsed into the same chair she'd sat in that morning, looking 10 years older than she had at dawn. "Drink this," Jonas said, pressing a glass of whiskey into her hand. She drank without protest, without even seeming to taste it, and Jonas refilled the glass twice more before she waved him off. "I want to read his journal," she said, pulling the leather book from the tin box. Will you stay while I do? I don't want to be alone with his words." So Jonas sat across from her while she read, watching the expressions cross her face: sadness, fondness, regret, love. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud, sharing glimpses of Henry Darnell with the man who'd killed his murderers. "Listen to this," she said. "Clara was singing while she made bread today. She has a terrible voice, truly awful, but I'd rather hear her sing off-key than the finest opera performed by professionals. She makes the house feel like a home instead of just a building. I am the luckiest man alive." Her voice broke on the last sentence, and Jonas felt that crack in his chest widen just a little more. "He sounds like he was a good man," Jonas said. "He was. He really was." Clara closed the journal, held it against her heart. "And now he's gone, and I have blood money and memories, and I don't know what to do with either one." "You survive," Jonas said simply. "That's what you do. You take it one day at a time, one breath at a time, until surviving doesn't take so much effort. And eventually, not soon, but eventually you find you can think about other things besides the pain." "Is that what you did after the war?" "That's what I tried to do. Not sure how well it worked, seeing as I spent 10 years alone on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, talking to horses and avoiding people. But you helped me. So maybe it worked better than you think." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness filled the valley and stars began emerging overhead. Jonas lit the oil lamp, made simple food that neither of them had much appetite for, and gradually felt the tension of the day begin to ease just slightly. "Jonas," Clara said as night deepened around them. "Yes?" "Thank you for finding Henry, for helping me bring him home or close to home, for letting me bury him somewhere I can visit instead of leaving him under that tree where nothing but his killers would know where he lay. You don't need to thank me for basic human decency. Don't I? Seems like basic human decency is in short supply these days." She stood moving carefully, holding her ribs. "I should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hard." "Take the bed again. I'll make do out here." Jonas, please, let me do this one small thing. Clara nodded, too exhausted to argue, and disappeared into the bedroom. Jonas heard the bed creak as she lay down, heard her breathing gradually even out into sleep. Only then did he allow himself to relax, leaning back in his chair and closing his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept replaying the day, the grave in the north pasture, the destroyed house, Henry's body under that tree, Clara's grief breaking over him in waves. And underneath it all, a growing certainty that this wasn't over. Couldn't be over. 3 men had died, but the gold was still here, and gold had a way of drawing trouble like blood drew sharks. Tomorrow they'd bury Henry Darnell beside Jonas's parents in the small plot behind the house. And after that, Jonas and Clara would have to decide what came next. Whether she would take her gold and her grief and disappear into whatever life waited for her beyond the horizon. Or whether Jonas didn't let himself finish that thought. Not yet. It was too soon, too raw, too complicated. But as he finally drifted toward sleep in his uncomfortable chair, listening to Clara breathe in the next room, he couldn't quite silence the small voice in his head that whispered, "Stay, both of you. Stay and see what grows in ground watered with so much blood and tears." Outside, the wind carried the smell of coming rain, and somewhere in the darkness that coyote sang its lonely song to the stars. Morning came with thunder rolling across the mountains like artillery fire, and Jonas woke with his hand already reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. He was on his feet before he fully realized where he was, not a battlefield, not a trench, just his own house with rain beginning to hammer against the roof. His neck ached from sleeping in the chair, and his back protested every movement as he straightened. Clara emerged from the bedroom looking worse than she had the night before. The bruising on her face had ripened to deep purple and sickly yellow, and she moved like every breath was a knife between her ribs. But her eyes were clear, determined, and Jonas recognized that look from the mirror on mornings when he'd decided to face something he'd been avoiding. "We should wait," he said, watching rain sheet down the windows. "Ground's going to be mud, and you're in no condition to stand in a downpour." "Henry's been lying in that wagon all night," Clara said, her voice rough from sleep and unshed tears. "I won't make him wait another day because of weather. Besides, maybe the rain is fitting, heaven crying for a good man." Jonas didn't believe in heaven or its tears, but he understood the need to find meaning in random things. He'd done the same during the war, reading portents in cloud formations and bird flights, desperately trying to believe the universe cared whether he lived or died. It didn't, of course, but the illusion had kept him sane on days when sanity was in short supply. They ate breakfast in silence, coffee and yesterday's bread, neither of them tasting it. Then Jonas fetched the shovel again, the same one he'd used to bury Clara's husband's killers, and they walked together through rain that soaked them to the bone before they'd gone 20 feet. The family plot sat on a small rise behind the barn, surrounded by a crooked fence Jonas had built 15 years ago when his mother died. 3 graves already rested there, his mother, his father, and a sister who'd died of fever before Jonas was old enough to remember her. He'd tended the plot carefully over the years, keeping the wooden crosses upright, and the grass trimmed the only sentimentality he allowed himself. Now he would add a 4th grave, a stranger's grave, a man he'd never met, but whose widow he'd killed for, bled for, and was beginning to care for in ways that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The digging was harder in the rain, the earth turning to thick clay that clung to the shovel and his boots. Clara stood watching water streaming down her face, rain and tears mixed together, until they were indistinguishable. She didn't offer to help this time, just held Henry's journal pressed against her chest under Jonas's coat, protecting it from the storm. "Tell me about your family," Clara said suddenly, raising her voice to be heard over the rain. "The people buried here? Who were they?" Jonas paused, leaning on the shovel, grateful for the excuse to rest. "My mother died first. Winter of 1860, just before the war started. She caught pneumonia and it settled in her lungs. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. She lasted 3 days. He drove the shovel back into the mud. My father, he died while I was away fighting. Letter took 6 months to reach me. By the time I got it, he'd been in the ground for half a year. Heart just gave out one day while he was mending fence. They said he was dead before he hit the ground." "I'm sorry." Clara said the same words everyone always said, words that meant everything and nothing. "The 3rd grave is my sister Margaret. She died when she was 3 and I was 5. I barely remember her except as this presence that was there and then wasn't. My mother never really got over it. Used to catch her standing out here talking to that grave like Margaret could hear her. Maybe she could. Maybe. Or maybe the dead are just dead and talking to graves is just something we do to make ourselves feel better. Clara flinched at that, and Jonas immediately regretted his bluntness. I'm sorry. That was cruel. Today of all days, you don't need my bitterness. No, you're probably right. Maybe Henry can't hear me, can't know I'm burying him here. But I'll know. And maybe that's enough. The hole took longer than the one in the north pasture, partly because of the rain, and partly because Jonas dug it with more care. This wasn't a grave for murderers. This was for a man who deserved rest and remembrance. When it was finally deep enough, Jonas climbed out and went to the barn where Henry Darnell waited in his blanket shroud. Together, Jonas and Clara carried the body to the grave. Henry had been a slight man in life, and death hadn't added any weight. But Clara struggled with her end of the burden. Jonas could hear her breathing go ragged, could see the way her face tightened with pain, but she refused to stop or rest. This was her duty, her burden to bear, and she would see it through. They lowered Henry into the earth as gently as they could, and Jonas stepped back to give Clara space. She stood at the edge of the grave, rain pouring over her, and opened Henry's journal with shaking hands. I don't know the right words, she said. Don't know prayers or scripture, but Henry wrote something once right after we got married. He said, I don't know what I did to deserve Clara, but whatever it was, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her love. Well, Henry, you were always worthy, from the first day to the last. You were kind and gentle and good, and the world is darker without you in it. Her voice broke, but she kept going. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry I ran when you needed me. Sorry that the last thing you probably saw was those men hurting you while I escaped. But I promise you this. I promise I'll survive. I'll take the life you wanted to give me and I'll live it. Not the same life maybe, but a life. And I'll remember you every day. Remember your kindness, your laugh, your terrible jokes, the way you cried over a bird. I'll carry you with me always. She closed the journal, kissed it, and tossed it into the grave. Then she looked at Jonas and nodded once, and he began filling in the hole, while Clara stood witness, the rain washing over them both like baptism or absolution. When the last shovelful of earth was tamped down, Jonas fashioned a simple cross from 2 pieces of wood and a length of rope. It wouldn't last forever, but it would serve until he could carve something more permanent. He scratched Henry's name into the wood with his knife. Henry Darnell born, 1844, died 1875, and planted it at the head of the grave. It's done, Jonas said quietly. Clara nodded but didn't move, just stood staring at the fresh earth as if she could see through it to the man beneath. Jonas gave her space, walking back toward the barn to put away the shovel, giving her time to say whatever private goodbyes she needed. When she finally returned to the house, she was shivering violently, her lips blue with cold despite the relative warmth of the rain. Jonas wrapped her in blankets and built up the fire while she sat like a statue staring at nothing. You need to get out of those wet clothes, he said, before you catch pneumonia like my mother did. Clara blinked, seeming to come back from wherever her mind had wandered. Yes, all right. But she didn't move, and after a moment Jonas realized she didn't have the strength. The past 2 days had drained her completely, left her hollow. He helped her to the bedroom, then stepped out while she changed, giving her what privacy he could. When she called that she was decent, he found her in one of the dresses they'd salvaged from her house, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hair dripping water onto the floor. Let me change that bandage, Jonas said, fetching his medical supplies. The wound on her head had bled through again, fresh red mixing with old brown. He unwrapped the cloth, carefully studied the stitches he'd put in 2 nights ago. They were holding, and there was no sign of infection, but the bruising around the wound had spread down the side of her face like spilled ink. You're going to have a scar, he said, cleaning the wound with whiskey. Right along the hairline, but your hair should cover most of it. I don't care about scars, Clara said. Scars just mean you survived something. It's the things that don't leave scars that hurt the most. Jonas wrapped fresh cloth around her head, tying it off with more gentleness than his rough hands usually managed. You should rest, sleep if you can. Your body needs time to heal. I don't want to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see Henry dying. See those men beating him while I hide like a coward. You weren't a coward. You survived. There's a difference. Is there? Sometimes I'm not sure. Jonas sat down beside her on the bed, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. During the war, there was a battle, Shiloh, if you've heard of it. 2 days of slaughter that made the ground run red. I was 20 years old and scared out of my mind. First real battle I'd been in, and the Confederates came at us like demons screaming that rebel yell that made your blood freeze. He paused, remembering. My friend Tommy, we'd enlisted together, grown up on neighboring farms. When the shooting started, Tommy froze. Just stood there while bullets flew around him. I grabbed him, tried to drag him to cover, but he wouldn't move, and then... Jonas closed his eyes. Then a cannonball took his head clean off. 1 second he was there, the next he was just a body falling. Clara made a soft sound of horror, but Jonas continued. I ran after that. Left my post, left my company, ran into the woods and hid behind a tree while the battle raged around me. I was sure I was going to die, sure God was punishing me for being a coward. But I didn't die. I survived. And the next day when the fighting started again, I went back. Picked up my rifle and did my duty. Not because I was brave, but because I was more afraid of living with shame than dying with honor. Why are you telling me this? Because running doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human. And coming back doing what needs to be done, even when you're terrified, that's what courage looks like. You ran from men who wanted to kill you, and that was smart. Now you're here standing up, burying your husband, figuring out how to keep living. That's not cowardice, Clara. That's strength. She turned to look at him. Really look at him. And Jonas felt something pass between them that he couldn't name. Not attraction exactly, though there was some of that. Not just gratitude or shared trauma, though those were present too. Something deeper, older, more fundamental, the recognition that they were both broken people trying to piece themselves back together in the aftermath of violence. Stay with me, Clara said suddenly. Not here in the bedroom, I mean, but stay in the room. Talk to me. Tell me more stories about the war or your family or anything. I can't be alone with my thoughts right now. So Jonas stayed. He pulled the room's single chair close to the bed and talked. He told her about his childhood on the farm, about learning to ride before he could walk properly, about his father teaching him to shoot by having him aim at cans on fence posts. He told her about the war, not all of it, not the worst parts, but enough to paint a picture of what those years had been like. The mud and blood and boredom punctuated by moments of terror. He told her about coming home to find everything changed, his father dead, his mother's grave weedy and neglected. About building this ranch from nothing, teaching himself to work metal in the forge, slowly creating something that was his alone. And as he talked, Clara's eyes gradually closed and her breathing evened out into sleep. But Jonas kept talking anyway, his voice low and steady, telling stories to the sleeping woman like his mother had once told stories to Margaret's grave. Maybe the dead couldn't hear. Maybe the sleeping couldn't either. But the act of telling that mattered. That was its own kind of healing. When he finally ran out of words, Jonas sat in silence and listened to the rain against the roof. The storm was passing, the thunder moving east toward the plains. Soon the sun would break through and the world would steam in the heat, and life would continue its relentless forward motion whether they were ready or not. A knock at the door shattered the quiet like a stone through glass. Jonas was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. Clara woke with a gasp, her eyes wide and frightened, and Jonas held up a hand to keep her quiet. He moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. A single rider sat a horse in his yard water, streaming off a wide-brimmed hat. The man was alone, didn't have a weapon drawn, and something about his posture suggested he was here on business rather than violence. Still, Jonas kept his hand on his gun as he opened the door. "Help you," Jonas called from the doorway, not inviting the stranger any closer. The man pushed his hat back, revealing a weathered face Jonas vaguely recognized. "Jonas Mercer, name's Bill Hartwell. I'm the sheriff over in Bitter Creek. Sorry to disturb you, but I need to ask you a few questions." Jonas felt his gut clench, but kept his expression neutral. "About what?" "About some men who've gone missing, and about a woman named Clara Darnell whose husband was found murdered in their home yesterday morning." Hartwell's eyes were sharp despite the friendly tone. "You mind if I come in out of this rain, or would you prefer to talk out here?" Behind him, Jonas heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. He glanced back to see her standing in the bedroom doorway, her face pale beneath the bruising, the bandage on her head stark white against her blonde hair. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Jonas made a decision. "Come on in, Sheriff. We've got a lot to talk about." Hartwell dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, then followed Jonas inside. His eyes immediately found Clara, and Jonas saw him taking in the bruises, the bandage, the way she held herself like someone who'd been beaten badly. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Mrs. Darnell, I presume," Hartwell said, removing his hat. "I'm Sheriff Hartwell. I'm very sorry for your loss. Your husband was a good man by all accounts." "Thank you," Clara said quietly, and Jonas heard the tremor in her voice that she was trying to hide. "How did you find me?" "I didn't exactly. Was actually looking for 3 men who were last seen heading this direction 2 nights ago. When I heard about your husband's murder and your disappearance, I put 2 and 2 together." Hartwell's gaze moved between Jonas and Clara, reading the situation with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years dealing with violence and its aftermath. "You want to tell me what happened?" Jonas and Clara exchanged a glance, and in that moment a silent conversation passed between them. How much to tell? How much to hide? The truth could get them both hanged, but lies could get them caught in a web they couldn't escape. In the end, it was Clara who spoke first. "They killed my husband," she said, her voice strengthening as she went. 3 men. They came looking for gold, said Henry's brother had told them before they killed him, that we had a fortune hidden. But we didn't. We had nothing. And when Henry couldn't tell them where gold that didn't exist was hidden, they beat him to death. "And you ran," Hartwell said. It wasn't a question. "I ran, crashed through a window and ran through the dark until I collapsed at Jonas's gate. He took me in, patched me up." She gestured at her bandaged head. "Saved my life." "And the 3 men?" Hartwell asked, his attention shifting to Jonas. "I'm guessing they followed her here." Jonas nodded slowly. "They did. Showed up after dark demanding I hand her over. I refused. They drew weapons. I defended my property." "All 3 of them dead, I presume?" "Yes, sir." "Where are the bodies?" This was the moment. The point where the truth could hang them both. Jonas held the sheriff's gaze and made his choice. "Buried them in my north pasture. Didn't see the point in bringing them to town for a funeral nobody would attend." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his thigh. "That's quite a story. 3 armed men all killed in self-defense. Must have been quite a fight." "It was," Jonas said simply. "You were in the war, weren't you, Mercer? I remember hearing about you when you first came to the territory. Saw action at Shiloh Antietam, some others." "Yes, sir." "So you know how to handle yourself in a fight. These men, they have names. If they did, they didn't share them with me." Hartwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's convenient. Makes it hard to verify your story if I can't identify the dead." "Sheriffs," Clara said, stepping forward despite the pain it clearly caused her. "Are you suggesting Jonas is lying, that he killed 3 men for some reason other than protecting me and his property?" "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm just trying to understand what happened. 3 men dead, no witnesses except the 2 of you, and a convenient story about gold and murder." He held up a hand as Clara started to protest. "I'm not saying I don't believe you. Your injuries are real enough, and Lord knows I've seen plenty of men capable of the kind of violence you're describing, but I have to ask the hard questions. It's my job." Jonas respected that. The sheriff was doing his duty, trying to separate truth from lies in a territory where both were in abundant supply. "What do you want from us, Sheriff? Confession evidence?" "We can show you where they're buried if that helps." "Actually, that would help considerably. I'd like to see the gravesite, and I'd like to examine the bodies if they're not too far gone." Hartwell settled his hat back on his head. "And I'd like the truth, the whole truth, because something about this story doesn't quite sit right with me." "What doesn't sit right?" Clara asked, her voice sharp. "Mrs. Darnell, 3 experienced men, and I know they were experienced because I've been tracking them for months now across 2 territories. Don't just die in a shootout with a rancher, no matter how good he is. These were hardened criminals, killers who knew their business, and they all died in one night. That takes either incredible luck or incredible skill, maybe both." Or maybe it takes defending something worth defending, Jonas said quietly. Maybe it takes being willing to die for someone instead of just being willing to kill for something. Hartwell studied Jonas for a long moment. That's a pretty sentiment, Mercer. Let's hope it holds up under scrutiny. Get your coat. We're going to take a ride. The rain had stopped, leaving the world clean and new, steam rising from the earth as the sun broke through the clouds. Jonas led the sheriff and Clara to the north pasture, to the spot where 3 men lay in their unmarked grave. Hartwell dismounted and walked around the area, his eyes missing nothing. The disturbed earth, the way the grass had been trampled, the dark stains on the ground near the house that even rain hadn't completely washed away. Here, Hartwell asked, pointing at the grave. Here, Jonas confirmed. Start digging. It took the better part of an hour to unearth the bodies. They'd already started to smell despite the cool earth, and flies had found them despite the depth. Clara stood upwind, her hand pressed to her mouth, while Jonas and Hartwell worked the shovels. When the first body was exposed enough to be examined, Hartwell climbed down into the hole for a closer look. This one took a shot to the chest, close range by the looks of the powder burns. He moved to the second body. This one too, and this third one. He paused, studying the young man's corpse. Died surprised. Can tell by the expression. Probably never knew what hit him. Hartwell climbed out of the hole and wiped his hands on his pants. That tallies with your story. Defensive shooting, not execution. Though I notice you're a damn good shot. 3 men, 3 killing shots. I told you I was in the war, Jonas said. So you did. Hartwell walked to where Clara stood and softened his voice. Mrs. Darnell, I need you to look at these men. Can you identify them as the ones who killed your husband? Clara swallowed hard but nodded. She approached the grave, looked down at the 3 faces already distorted by death and beginning decomposition, and Jonas saw her flinch. But she looked, really looked, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. The tall one with the scar, he's the one who gave the orders, who said he was going to cut the information out of Henry piece by piece. The short one, he was the first to hit Henry. And the young one, she paused. The young one just watched, just stood there watching while they killed my husband, and he didn't do anything to stop it. That's them, Hartwell said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. Jack, Scarface, Malone Bill Cotton, and Tommy Reeves. Been hunting them for 6 months now. They've left a trail of bodies from here to Kansas, robberies, murders, at least 1 rape we know of. Territorial Marshal's been after them too. He looked at Jonas with new respect. You did the world a favor, Mercer. Jonas felt relief wash over him, but kept his expression neutral. Just did what needed doing. Still, there'll need to be an inquest. Formality mostly, but the law's the law. You'll both need to come to Bitter Creek in the next few days and give official statements. Hartwell started walking back toward his horse. In the meantime, I'd recommend you fill that hole back in. Bodies don't improve with time. Sheriff, Clara called after him. What about Henry? My husband. Did you? She trailed off, unable to finish the question. Hartwell's expression gentled. We found him under a tree near your house. Buried him in the town cemetery day before yesterday. Reverend Matthews said some words over him. I'm sorry we couldn't wait for you, but in this heat, I understand, thank you, for treating him with respect. He deserved that and more, ma'am. Hartwell mounted his horse, then paused. One more thing. There's been talk about gold, about Henry's brother finding a cache somewhere and hiding it. These men, they believed that story enough to kill for it. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Jonas felt his heart rate spike, but Clara's answer was immediate and convincing. Sheriff, if there was any gold, don't you think Henry would have told those men where it was, would have traded that information for his life? There is no gold. It was just a story, a lie that got my husband killed. Hartwell studied her face, then nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. Still, rumors have a way of spreading. If I were you, I'd be careful. Other men might come looking, might believe that story, despite all evidence to the contrary. He tipped his hat. I'll expect to see you both in town within the week. And Mercer. Thank you for doing what most men wouldn't have the courage or skill to do. They watched him ride away, waiting until he was just a speck on the horizon before either of them spoke. Then Clara turned to Jonas, and he saw the fear in her eyes that she'd been hiding from the sheriff. He knows, she said. About the gold. He suspects. He suspects there might be gold. He doesn't know we have it, and as long as we're careful, he never will. But other men will come, like he said. Other men who've heard the stories, who think we're sitting on a fortune. Let them come, Jonas said, his voice harder than he intended. Let them all come. They'll find the same thing those three did. More bodies to bury? More lies to tell Jonas. I don't want to live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next group of killers to show up. Jonas filled in the grave while Clara watched the silence between them, heavy with unspoken concerns. When the last shovelful of earth was tamped down, he turned to face her. Then we leave. Take the gold, take what we can carry, and go somewhere far from here. Somewhere nobody knows our names or our story. Run away. Start over. There's a difference. Clara was quiet for a long time, her eyes distant, and Jonas knew she was thinking about Henry, about the life they'd planned that would never happen now, about the woman she'd been before violence changed her into someone new. Finally, she shook her head. No, I'm done running. Those men made me run once, made me crash through a window and flee into the dark like an animal. I won't do it again. This is your home, Jonas. You built it with your own hands, made something real here. I won't be the reason you lose that. Clara? Besides, she continued, a hint of steel entering her voice. If we run, we'll always be running. There'll always be another rumor, another group of men who think they can take what's ours. Better to stand our ground here where we have the advantage of knowing the land. Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that no piece of land was worth dying for. But looking at her standing there with the sun breaking through clouds behind her, her chin raised defiantly despite the bruises and bandages, he realized she was right. Running solved nothing. It just changed the location of your problems. All right, Tseng, he said. We stay. But we're going to need to be smart about this. The gold stays hidden, not in the house, somewhere better. And we need to come up with a story that explains why you're still here, why you're not moving on. What kind of story? Jonas hesitated, then spoke the words that had been forming in his mind since the night Clara collapsed at his gate. We tell people you're my wife, that we got married quiet-like, and you came here to help me run the ranch, that Henry was your brother who was visiting when he got killed. It's not perfect, but it explains your presence here without raising too many questions. Clara stared at him. You want us to pretend to be married. I want us to have a reason to be living under the same roof that doesn't involve gold or murder or anything that'll bring more trouble to our doorstep. If we're married, if people think we're married, then you have every right to be here. No questions, no suspicions. That's... Clara started, then stopped. That's actually not a bad idea, but won't the sheriff know? He knows Henry was my husband. We say you remarried quick because you needed protection, needed a man's name to shield you from fortune hunters and worse. It's not unheard of in the territory widows marry fast out here for survival. And given what happened to you, given that you're clearly in need of protection, most folks will understand. Clara thought about it, chewing her lower lip. We'd have to sell the performance, act like a married couple whenever anyone's around. I don't know if I can do that. Don't know if it's right lying to people like that. Clara, those 3 men are dead because they believed a lie about gold. Your husband is dead because of that same lie. The truth, the whole truth, is a luxury we can't afford right now. Sometimes survival requires choosing the lesser of 2 evils. The lesser evil of pretending to be your wife. The lesser evil of lying about our relationship instead of becoming the next bodies in a grave because someone wanted what we have. She met his eyes, and Jonas saw her weighing it all, the danger, the deception, the strange intimacy of the arrangement he was proposing. If we do this, she said finally, there need to be rules, boundaries. This is pretend a performance for the outside world. In private, we're just 2 people sharing a house out of necessity. Agreed? Agreed, Jonas said, though part of him, a part he refused to examine too closely, felt disappointed by that stipulation. And if either of us decides this isn't working, we can end the arrangement. No hard feelings, no arguments. I'll take my share of the gold and move on. Fair enough? Clara extended her hand, formal as a business transaction. Then I guess we have a deal, Mr. Mercer. Jonas took her hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath skin that was still healing. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Mercer." They walked back to the house together, and Jonas felt the weight of all the changes settling over him like a heavy coat. 2 days ago, he'd been alone, isolated, content in his solitude. Now he had a pretend wife, a fortune in stolen gold, 3 men buried in his pasture, and a sheriff who'd be watching him more closely than he'd like. Everything had changed, shifted, become complicated in ways he couldn't have predicted. But as he held the door open for Clara and watched her step into his house, their house now at least in the story they'd tell, Jonas realized he didn't entirely mind the complications. Solitude had been safe, but it had also been empty. Having Clara here, having someone to talk to, someone to protect, someone who looked at him like he was more than just a scarred veteran hiding from the world that filled spaces in himself he hadn't even known were empty. "We should practice," Clara said once they were inside. "If we're going to convince anyone we're married, we need to be comfortable around each other, need to act natural." "What did you have in mind?" Clara thought for a moment. "Tell me things a husband should know about his wife. My favorite color, what I like to eat, how I take my coffee. And I'll do the same for you. We need to know each other well enough that our story holds up under questioning." So they spent the rest of the afternoon trading histories, learning each other's lives in compressed form. Jonas discovered that Clara's favorite color was green because it reminded her of spring and new growth. That she'd been born in Ohio but came west with her parents as a child. That her mother had died of cholera when Clara was 12, and she'd helped raise her younger siblings until they were old enough to fend for themselves. That she could sew and cook and keep account skills she'd learned from her mother before illness took her. Clara learned that Jonas preferred coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. That he'd learned to work metal from his father, who'd been a farrier before becoming a rancher. That he'd had a dog once before the war, a mutt named Soldier who'd followed him everywhere until the day the recruitment officer came and Jonas left for training. That he'd been engaged once to a girl named Mary, but she'd married someone else while Jonas was away fighting, and he'd never blamed her for choosing certainty over waiting for a man who might never come home. As they talked, the strangeness between them began to ease, replaced by something warmer, more companionable. They were still essentially strangers thrown together by violence and circumstance, but they were beginning to know each other, beginning to find the rhythms of shared space, shared survival, shared secrets that bound them together more surely than any legal document. Evening was falling when Clara suddenly asked, "Do you have regrets about helping me? I mean, your life was simple before I showed up. Now it's complicated." Jonas considered the question, really considered it. Did he regret pulling Clara from that hole to face the sheriff? Did he regret killing 3 men and burying them in his pasture? Did he regret the lies they'd have to tell and the pretense they'd have to maintain? "No," he said finally. "No regrets. Maybe a smarter man would. But when I think about turning you away, about letting those men take you, about spending the rest of my life alone on this ranch with only ghosts for company," he shook his head. "No. Whatever happens next, whatever trouble comes calling, I'd make the same choice again." Clara smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, though it was lopsided because of her split lip. "Good, because I think I'm starting to believe we might actually survive this. Together." "Together," Jonas echoed, and the word felt like a promise, a vow more binding than any marriage ceremony could ever be. Outside, the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the sky in colors that reminded Jonas of fire and metal fresh from the forge. The cattle settled for the night, the wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance that eternal coyote sang its song to the emerging stars. And in the house on the edge of nowhere, 2 broken people sat across from each other and began building something new from the ruins of their old lives. Something that looked a little like friendship, felt a little like family, and might, given time and luck, and the determination to survive whatever came next, become something even more precious than all the gold in the world. 3 days later, they made the journey to Bitter Creek in Jonas's wagon, the wooden wheels creaking over ruts that had been carved by countless travelers before them. Clara sat beside Jonas on the bench seat, wearing one of the dresses they'd salvaged from her house, her hair carefully arranged to hide the worst of the bandage. The bruising on her face had faded from purple to yellow-green, still visible, but less shocking than it had been. Jonas had shaved for the first time in weeks, scraping away his beard to reveal a jaw that Clara studied with barely concealed surprise. "You look different," she'd said that morning as he'd wiped away the last of the soap. "Younger, less like a hermit, more like a man." "That was the idea, Bus," he'd replied, though he hadn't admitted that her opinion mattered more than it should have. Now, as Bitter Creek came into view, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained, Jonas felt Clara stiffen beside him. This would be their first real test, the first time they'd have to sell the story they'd concocted. If anyone doubted them, if their performance faltered, questions would be asked that they couldn't afford to answer. "Remember," Jonas said quietly, "we got married 3 days after Henry died. Quick ceremony, just us and a traveling preacher. You needed protection, needed a man's name to shield you from fortune hunters. Nobody will think less of you for it. Widows marry fast out here. It's practical." "I know the story," Clara said, but her hands were twisting in her lap, betraying her nervousness. "I just hope I can sell it convincingly. You've been through hell and survived. Pretending to be my wife should be easy in comparison." She turned to look at him, and something flickered in her eyes that Jonas couldn't quite read. "Should it?" Before he could answer, they were pulling up in front of the sheriff's office, and Bill Hartwell was stepping out onto the wooden sidewalk, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile. "Right on time," he called. "I appreciate punctuality. Come on inside and we'll get this business sorted." The interior of the sheriff's office smelled of old coffee and tobacco smoke, with wanted posters papering the walls like grim wallpaper. Hartwell gestured them to chairs in front of his desk, then settled into his own seat with a sigh that suggested his back was bothering him. "Before we begin," he said, pulling out a ledger and a pen, "I should tell you that the territorial marshal sent word. He's satisfied with my report on the deaths of Malone Cotton and Reeves. Considers the matter closed. You're not facing any charges, Mercer. Self-defense is clear enough given Mrs. Darnell's testimony and the evidence at the scene." Jonas felt relief wash through him, though he kept his expression neutral. "That's good to hear. However," Hartwell continued, dipping his pen in ink, "there are still some details I need for the official record. Mrs. Darnell, I'll need you to walk me through the events of that night one more time. Start from when the men arrived at your home." Clara took a breath and Jonas saw her hands clench in her lap. But when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, each word chosen with care. She described the 3 men breaking into her home, demanding gold, refusing to believe Henry when he said there was none. She described the beating, the terror, her desperate flight through the darkness. Her voice only wavered once when she described hearing Henry's screams behind her as she ran. Hartwell's pen scratched across paper, recording it all in neat, methodical script. When Clara finished, he looked up at her with something like sympathy in his weathered face. "That must have been terrifying. You're a brave woman to have survived it." "I'm not brave," Clara said quietly. "I'm just alive. There's a difference. Sometimes being alive takes more courage than dying." Hartwell turned his attention to Jonas. "Now, Mercer, tell me about the fight. Every detail you can remember." Jonas recounted the confrontation, the 3 riders in his yard, their demands, his refusal. He described the moment the shooting started, the chaos of it, the instincts from the war that had taken over. He kept his story simple, consistent with what Clara had told the sheriff 3 days ago, adding just enough detail to make it believable without embellishing. When he finished, Hartwell sat back in his chair, studying them both with eyes that had seen more than their share of liars and truth-tellers. "You 2 make a good team," he said finally. "Stories match up perfectly. Almost too perfectly if I was the suspicious type." "Are you?" Jonas asked. "The suspicious type?" "I am. Part of the job." Hartwell closed the ledger with a definitive thump. "But in this case, I don't see any reason to be. 3 known killers dead, a widow rescued, justice served without the territory having to pay for a trial and execution. Seems like a clean enough ending to me. Then we're free to go," Clara asked. "You are. Though I'd recommend staying close to home for a while. Let the gossip die down. Let people forget about the gold rumors. The less attention you draw, the better. Hartwell stood, offering his hand first to Jonas, then to Clara. And Mrs. Darnell, I'm sorry for your loss. Henry was a good man. They were almost to the door when Hartwell's voice stopped them. One more thing. I heard you two got married. That true? Jonas felt Clara tense beside him, but he turned smoothly, his arm moving naturally to rest on the small of her back, a gesture he'd seen married men make 1,000 times. It is. Happened quick, but Clara needed protection, and I... He glanced at her, and the look he gave her wasn't entirely performance. I couldn't stand the thought of her facing the world alone after what she'd been through. Fast work. Hartwell observed, his tone neutral. Henry, not even a week in the ground. Out here, sheriff widows can't afford to grieve long, Clara said, and there was steel in her voice that Jonas had come to recognize. I needed safety. Jonas offered it. Seemed foolish to refuse out of concern for what people might say. I suppose you're right. Congratulations, then. I hope you'll both be very happy. But there was something in Hartwell's eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, and Jonas felt a prickle of unease as they stepped back out into the sunlight. He doesn't believe us, Clara murmured as they walked toward the wagon. He believes enough. And even if he doesn't, there's nothing he can do about it. We're not breaking any laws by getting married. They were climbing into the wagon when a woman's voice called out from across the street. Clara Darnell, is that really you? Jonas saw Clara freeze her face, going pale beneath the fading bruises. A woman was hurrying toward them, perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and a kind face that was currently creased with concern. She wore a simple calico dress and an apron that suggested she'd been cooking, and she moved with the determined purpose of someone who wouldn't be ignored. Mrs. Patterson, Clara said, and Jonas heard resignation in her voice. I didn't expect to see you here. I'm so sorry about Henry, the woman said, reaching up to take Clara's hands in her own. When I heard what happened, I couldn't believe it. Such a good man killed by those animals. Are you all right? Where are you staying? You can't possibly go back to that house alone. She's not alone, Jonas said, stepping in before Clara had to explain. I'm Jonas Mercer, Clara's husband. Mrs. Patterson's head swiveled toward him so fast Jonas heard her neck crack. Husband. But I thought Henry was her husband, unless... Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. Oh, I see. You remarried. The judgment in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. I did, Clara said, and Jonas heard the defiance creeping into her voice. Jonas saved my life, Mrs. Patterson. When those men came after me when I had nowhere else to go, he took me in. He protected me. And yes, we married quickly because I needed protection, and he offered it. I make no apologies for choosing survival over propriety. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. I suppose I can understand that, dear. These are harsh times and women alone. Well, it's not safe. Still, it's all rather sudden, isn't it? Sudden, Jonas said, was those 3 men beating Clara's brother to death while searching for gold that didn't exist. Sudden was her running through the dark with killers on her trail. Marrying me. That was just practical. Brother, Mrs. Patterson's confusion was evident. But I thought Henry was her... My brother, Clara interrupted smoothly, and Jonas felt a flash of admiration at how quickly she'd adapted the story. Jonas and I were married before years ago, but we'd lost touch. When I found myself in danger when I needed help, he was there. Henry was visiting us when those men came. Wrong place, wrong time. The lie came so easily from Clara's lips that Jonas almost believed it himself. Mrs. Patterson's face showed her confusion as she tried to reconcile this new version of events with what she thought she knew, but before she could ask more questions, Clara was saying her goodbyes and climbing into the wagon. We should go, Clara said to Jonas. Long ride back, and I'd like to arrive before dark. Jonas didn't argue, just clicked his tongue at the horses and set them moving down the main street of Bitter Creek. Behind them he could feel Mrs. Patterson watching, could imagine the questions brewing in her mind, the conversations she'd have with neighbors about Clara Darnell's suspiciously quick remarriage. They were a mile out of town before Clara spoke. That was terrible. I couldn't even keep the story straight. Said Henry was my brother when I should have said husband, then had to scramble to make it work. You did fine. Better than fine, you turned a mistake into something believable. And honestly, the confusion might help us. If people can't quite remember the details, if the story shifts a little in the telling, it becomes harder to pin down what's truth and what's not. Clara laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Is that what we're doing now? Deliberately confusing people so they can't tell what's real. We're protecting ourselves. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like we're just digging ourselves deeper into a hole we might never climb out of. How many lies do we have to tell before we can't remember the truth anymore? Jonas didn't have an answer for that. The lies were piling up: the pretend marriage, the story about Henry being Clara's brother or husband, depending on who was asking the hidden gold that supposedly didn't exist. Each lie required more lies to support it, a structure of deception that grew more complex and fragile with every passing day. But what was the alternative? Tell the truth and watch men come from every corner of the territory drawn by rumors of gold like sharks to blood. Watch Clara become a target for every fortune hunter and killer who thought he could take what wasn't his. No. The lies were necessary. They had to be. The afternoon was wearing toward evening when they finally arrived back at the ranch. Jonas helped Clara down from the wagon, noting how she winced when she moved too quickly, how her ribs were still protesting the beating she'd taken. She was healing but slowly, and Jonas wondered if some wounds, the ones on the inside, would ever fully heal. I need to check on the cattle, he said. Make sure they didn't break through the fence while we were gone. You should rest. I've been resting for days. What I need is to do something useful, something that makes me feel less like a burden. Clara looked around the ranch at the weathered buildings, an overgrown garden plot. This place could use a woman's touch. When was the last time you planted vegetables, or had curtains in the windows, or swept the floor for that matter? Jonas felt a flush of embarrassment. I'm not much for housekeeping. Never saw the point when it was just me. Well, it's not just you anymore. And if we're going to convince people we're married, this place needs to look like a woman lives here. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to fix up this house until it looks like a proper home instead of a bachelor's cave. Despite himself, Jonas smiled. Yes, ma'am. Whatever you say, ma'am. Don't patronize me, Jonas Mercer. I'm serious about this. If I'm going to live here, if I'm going to pretend to be your wife, then this is going to be a place I can stand to live in. She stalked into the house with as much dignity as her injuries allowed, and Jonas stood in the yard listening to her bang around inside, moving things, muttering about dust and cobwebs and men who lived like animals. And despite everything, despite the lies and the danger and the complications that seemed to multiply with each passing day, Jonas found himself grinning. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara transformed the ranch. She started with the house sweeping and scrubbing until every surface gleamed. She took down the dusty blanket Jonas had tacked over one window and replaced it with curtains she made from fabric they bought on a trip to town, simple white cotton, but they caught the sunlight and made the whole room feel brighter, more alive. She planted a garden in the plot behind the house that Jonas's mother had once tended, coaxing seeds into soil that had gone fallow. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs, all the things that would turn meals from fuel into something approaching pleasure. She repaired the fence around the chicken coop and convinced Jonas to buy a dozen laying hens so they'd have fresh eggs every morning instead of the hardtack and jerky he'd been living on. And slowly, day by day, the ranch began to feel less like a hermit's hideaway and more like a home. Jonas found himself making changes too. He repaired the porch steps that had been loose for years. He built Clara a proper clothesline and a bench to sit on while she shelled peas or mended clothes. He even made an attempt at building furniture, a second chair for the kitchen table, a small bookshelf for the few books Clara had salvaged from her old house. They fell into rhythms, patterns of daily life that felt almost normal. Jonas would wake before dawn and tend to the animals while Clara made breakfast. They'd eat together, talking about the day's work, then separate to their tasks. Evenings they'd spend on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie while they shared whatever stories came to mind. It was domestic, it was peaceful, and it was, Jonas realized with some surprise, making him happy in ways he hadn't been happy since before the war. But the peace couldn't last forever. Nothing good ever did. The trouble came on a Wednesday afternoon when Jonas was working in the forge, shaping new hinges for the barn door. He heard the horses before he saw them, multiple riders moving fast. His hand went instinctively to the rifle he now kept always within reach, and he stepped out of the forge to find 3 men reining up in his yard. They weren't the kind of men who came calling with good intentions. The leader was heavy-set, with a face like worn leather, and eyes that calculated odds before most people finished saying hello. The 2 with him were younger, harder, with the look of men who'd kill for wages and sleep soundly afterward. "Help you, gentlemen," Jonas called, his hand resting casually near his rifle. "Looking for Jonas Mercer." The leader said, his voice surprisingly cultured for someone who looked like he'd been born in a saddle. "Heard this is his place." "You heard right. What's your business?" "Name's Carson. Edmund Carson. I'm a private investigator out of Denver, hired to look into the deaths of 3 men, Jack Malone, Bill Cotton, and Tommy Reeves. Understand you killed them." Jonas felt ice settle in his gut, but his expression stayed neutral. "Killed them in self-defense. Sheriff investigated, case is closed." "Oh, I'm not disputing that. Not my concern whether they deserved killing or not. What concerns me is what they were after when they died. Specifically, a quantity of gold that's gone missing." Carson smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. $17,000 in gold coins, to be exact. Belonged to a mining consortium in California until it was stolen 3 months ago by those 3 men. The consortium hired me to recover it. "Then you're out of luck. There's no gold here. Those men were chasing a rumor, nothing more." "That's so funny thing about rumors, sometimes they're truer than the truth." Carson dismounted, his 2 companions following suit. "You mind if we take a look around, just to satisfy my employer that I've been thorough?" "Yes, I mind. This is private property, and you've got no legal authority here. You want to search my land, get a warrant." Carson's smile widened. "Now, Mr. Mercer, there's no need for unpleasantness. I'm just trying to do my job. And if the gold's not here like you say, then you've got nothing to hide. So what's the harm in letting us look?" "The harm?" Jonas said, his voice dropping into a register he'd used during the war when giving orders he expected to be obeyed, "is that you're standing on my land making demands you've got no right to make. Now I'll tell you one time politely, get back on your horses and ride off my property." One of the younger men, a rail-thin fellow with a scar bisecting his lip, laughed. "Or what, old man, you'll shoot us like you shot Malone and his boys. That's murder case closed or not." "Self-defense once, murder twice, the other young one added, cracking his knuckles in what he probably thought was an intimidating gesture. "Sheriff might not look so kindly on you killing 3 more men." Jonas was about to respond when Clara's voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Gentlemen, is there a problem?" She'd emerged from the house, and Jonas felt his heart lurch at the sight of her standing there fully exposed to these dangerous men. But Clara wasn't cowering. She stood tall, a shotgun cradled in her arms, with the kind of casual competence that suggested she knew how to use it, and her eyes were hard as flint. Carson's attention shifted to her, and Jonas saw the calculation in his eyes. "Mrs. Mercer, I presume I'm Edmund Carson, and I'm here about some missing gold. Your husband seems reluctant to let me search the premises." "My husband," Clara said, her voice cold, "is protecting his property from strangers who show up making accusations, as any reasonable man would do. And I'm standing here telling you the same thing he did. There's no gold. Those 3 men who came here looking for it, they tore apart my brother's house, beat him to death, nearly killed me, all for gold that never existed except in their greedy imaginations. Your brother—" Carson's eyebrows rose. "Thought his name was Darnell. Henry Darnell. Public records show he was married to a Clara Darnell." Jonas saw Clara pale slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I was married before to Jonas. When my first marriage ended, I took my maiden name back. Met Henry later, but we weren't— It was complicated. The point is, those men killed him for nothing, and if you think we're sitting on some fortune, you're as deluded as they were." Carson studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention back to Jonas. "You're both very convincing, but here's what I know: those 3 men stole $17,000 in gold. They were tracking leads that brought them to this area. They died here on your property searching for something, and now you're both living comfortable on a ranch that should barely support 1 person, let alone 2. That's an awful lot of coincidence." "Sometimes coincidences are just coincidences," Jonas said. "Now I've asked you politely. And my wife has asked you politely. I'm not going to ask a third time." The two younger men's hands drifted toward their guns, and Jonas saw the calculation in Carson's eyes, weighing odds, measuring distances, deciding if whatever his employer was paying him was worth the risk of a gunfight. Apparently it wasn't. Carson raised his hands in a gesture of peace, though his smile never wavered. "No need for things to get ugly. We'll be going. But Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, this isn't over. My employer is a patient man, but he doesn't give up easy. That gold went missing and it's going to be found. If it's here, we'll prove it eventually. And if you're hiding it," he shrugged, "well, let's just say the law takes a dim view of stolen property." "Get off my land," Jonas said, and this time there was no politeness in his voice, just cold iron. Carson and his men mounted up, but before they rode off, Carson called back one more warning. "I'll be watching you both. Every purchase you make, every bit of money you spend. If that gold starts showing up, I'll know. And when I know, everyone will know. Think about that next time you're tempted to spend what isn't yours." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Jonas stood watching until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he turn to Clara, who was lowering the shotgun with shaking hands. "You shouldn't have come out," he said. "Those men were dangerous." "So are we," Clara replied. "Or have you forgotten the bodies in your north pasture? Besides, you needed backup. Thought I'd provide it." Despite the situation, Jonas felt a surge of admiration. "You did good. Kept your head back the story, even when he tried to trip you up with that question about Henry. I hated lying again, hated adding more deception to the pile." Clara set the shotgun against the house and sank down onto the porch steps like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. But what choice did we have? If we'd told the truth, if we'd admitted the gold exists, they'd tear this place apart until they found it. And then what? We give it up after everything we've been through. Jonas sat down beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. We knew this might happen. Knew the gold would draw attention eventually. The question is what we do about it. We can't spend it. Not now, not with Carson watching us. The moment we try to use any of that gold, he'll know. He'll come back with proof and maybe the law, and we'll lose everything. So we sit on it, wait him out. Eventually his employer will decide it's not worth the cost of keeping Carson on our trail, and they'll give up. And if they don't give up, if Carson camps out in Bitter Creek watching our every move waiting for us to slip up. Jonas didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence as the sun moved toward the horizon, painting the sky in the colors of fire and blood. Around them, the ranch continued its daily rhythms. Cattle lowing chickens, scratching the wind, moving through grass that had grown tall and golden under summer sun. "I've been thinking," Clara said finally, "about what we're doing here. This pretend marriage, this life we're building. It's based on lies, Jonas. Every bit of it. We're lying to the law, lying to our neighbors, lying to people like Mrs. Patterson, who probably suspect something's wrong but can't quite figure out what. How long can we keep that up? How long before the weight of all those lies crushes us?" "As long as we have to," Jonas said. "As long as it takes to survive." But what kind of survival is it? Living in constant fear that someone will discover the truth. Always looking over our shoulders, always calculating what we can say and what we can't. That's not living, Jonas. That's just existing, waiting for the axe to fall. Jonas turned to look at her. Really look at her. The bruises had faded to almost nothing now, just faint shadows that would disappear entirely in another week. The wound on her head was healing, hidden beneath hair that she no longer bothered to arrange so carefully. She looked healthier than she had 2 weeks ago, stronger, more present. But there was something in her eyes, a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, that worried him. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying maybe we should just give the gold back. Tell Carson where it is, let his employer have it, and be done with it. Start fresh without this weight hanging over us." "That gold is yours, Clara, paid for in your husband's blood and your pain and everything you've lost. You want to just hand it over to some mining consortium that probably has more money than they know what to do with?" "I want to be free," Clara said, and her voice broke on the last word. "Free from the fear. Free from the lies. Free from wondering every time someone rides up whether they're coming to kill us or arrest us or just ask more questions we can't answer honestly. Is that so much to ask? Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her they just needed to be patient, that eventually things would settle down and they could figure out how to spend the gold safely. But looking at her face, seeing the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope for something better, he found he couldn't force the words out. "Let me think about it," he said instead. "Let me figure out if there's a way to make this right that doesn't involve giving up everything you're entitled to. Can you give me that?" "A little more time." Clara nodded slowly. "A little more time. But Jonas, we can't live like this forever. Eventually, we're going to have to choose keep the gold and keep lying or give it up and find some kind of peace. There's no middle ground. Not anymore." She went inside, leaving Jonas sitting alone on the porch as darkness gathered around him. Above stars were beginning to emerge those same patient lights that had watched over battlefields and burial grounds and countless human dramas, too small for history to remember. Jonas thought about the gold hidden beneath the floorboards of his barn, wrapped in canvas and buried under 6 feet of hay. $17,000 that had cost Clara her husband Henry his life, 3 killers their futures. Money that was supposed to make things better, but seemed to only make things more complicated. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe the gold was more curse than blessing, a weight that would drag them down no matter how carefully they tried to carry it. But giving it up, handing over what they'd fought for, what they'd buried men for, that felt like surrender. And Jonas Mercer had never been good at surrendering. He was still sitting there, wrestling with impossible choices, when he heard the sound of a horse approaching through the darkness. Just one rider this time, moving slowly, carefully, as if not wanting to spook anyone. Jonas's hand found his rifle, and he stepped to the edge of the porch, peering into the gloom. The rider resolved into a familiar silhouette, Sheriff Hartwell, his badge catching what little light the stars provided. "Evening, Mercer," Hartwell called, raising his hands to show they were empty. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk, and I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say." Jonas kept the rifle trained on Hartwell, even as he gestured for the sheriff to dismount. Trust was a commodity he'd learned not to spend freely, especially when men showed up after dark with promises of important conversations. The sheriff swung down from his horse with a grunt that spoke of old injuries and longer days, then tied the reins to the porch rail with deliberate, unthreatening movements. "Coffee would be welcome if you're offering," Hartwell said, "but I'll understand if you'd rather keep that rifle pointed at me until you hear what I came to say." "Talk first," Jonas replied. "Coffee after, if I decide you've earned it." Clara appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices, and Jonas saw her eyes widen when she recognized their visitor. "Sheriff, this is unexpected. Mrs. Mercer, sorry for the late hour, but this couldn't wait." Hartwell looked between them, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Had a visitor today. Man named Edmund Carson says he's a private investigator. Came asking questions about you two, about gold, about whether I thought you were hiding something." Jonas felt his grip tighten on the rifle. "What did you tell him?" "Told him to mind his own business and stay out of mine. Told him my investigation was closed, and unless he had new evidence of a crime, I didn't appreciate him stirring up trouble in my territory." Hartwell pulled out a cigarette, then seemed to think better of it and put it back. "But here's the thing, Carson's persistent, and he's got resources. He showed me paperwork, legitimate paperwork, proving that $17,000 in gold was stolen from a mining operation in California 3 months back. Showed me witness statements putting Malone and his crew near the robbery. Even had photographs." "Then he should be happy," Clara said, her voice tight. "The men who stole his gold are dead. Justice served." "That's what I told him. But Carson, he's got this theory. Says the gold never made it back to California, which means it's still out here somewhere. And since those 3 died on your property, Mr. Mercer searching for gold," Hartwell let the implication hang in the air like smoke. "Searching for gold that didn't exist," Jonas said firmly. "They were chasing rumors, died for nothing." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Jonas heard everything the sheriff wasn't saying. The doubts, the suspicions, the careful calculation of a lawman who'd spent years learning to tell truth from lies. "Here's what I believe," Hartwell said finally. "I believe those 3 men came to Clara's home looking for gold. I believe they killed her husband, her brother. Whichever story we're telling this week when he couldn't or wouldn't tell them where it was. I believe Clara ran for her life and ended up here. And I believe you, Mercer, killed those men to protect her. All of that I believe without question." He paused, and Jonas heard the change in his tone before the words came. "But I also believe there's more to this story than either of you is telling. And I believe that Carson isn't going to stop digging until he finds whatever truth you're hiding. So here's what I came to say. If there's something you need to tell me, now would be the time. Because once Carson finds it on his own, and men like that always find what they're looking for eventually, I won't be able to protect you." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. Jonas looked at Clara, saw the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope in her eyes, and knew they'd reached the moment she'd been talking about. The moment when they had to choose keep lying and risk everything, or tell the truth and face whatever consequences came with it. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we told you there was gold, hypothetically speaking? What would you do?" Hartwell's expression didn't change, but Jonas saw something shift in his eyes. Understanding maybe, or confirmation of suspicions he'd held all along. "Hypothetically, I'd ask where you got it, whether you stole it, found it, or came by it honestly. And depending on that answer, I'd have to decide what my duty was as a lawman versus what my conscience said was right." "And if we came by it honestly?" Jonas asked. "If it was in Clara's house, hidden by her husband's brother, and she grabbed it when she ran because it was the only thing of value she could carry, then legally it belongs to her. Gold found on your own property, even if it was originally stolen, becomes yours in the eyes of territorial law. The mining consortium might argue otherwise, might try to prove ownership, but that's a civil matter, not my jurisdiction." Hartwell looked directly at Jonas. "Of course, that only works if the gold really was in Clara's house and not somewhere else. If someone took it from the bodies of dead men, for instance, that becomes theft, and theft I'd have to act on." Jonas understood what the sheriff was offering: a way out, a legal fiction they could hide behind. But it required one more lie, one more addition to the structure of deception that Clara had said was crushing them both. "May we have a moment?" Clara asked. "To discuss this privately?" Hartwell nodded. "Take your time. I've got nowhere pressing to be." Jonas and Clara retreated into the house, closing the door behind them. In the lamplight, Jonas could see Clara's hands shaking, could see the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "We have to tell him," she said. "Have to tell him the truth. I can't do this anymore, Jonas. Can't keep lying, can't keep pretending, can't keep looking over my shoulder waiting for the next Edmund Carson to show up with more questions we can't answer. I'm done. I'm just done." If we tell him everything, Carson might still cause trouble. Might argue that the gold should be returned to his employer regardless of territorial law. Then let him argue. Let him take us to court. Hire lawyers. Do whatever he needs to do. At least it'll be honest. At least we won't be living in constant fear of being discovered. Clara grabbed Jonas's hands, squeezing them with surprising strength. "Please. I know this gold is supposed to be our future, supposed to give us security and freedom and all the things we've lost. But what good is any of that if we're too afraid to live? If every knock on the door might be someone coming to destroy us?" Jonas looked at her. Really looked at her, and saw not the terrified woman who'd collapsed at his gate 3 weeks ago, but someone stronger, clearer, more certain of what she needed. And he realized that somewhere along the way, her needs had become more important to him than the gold, than the lies, than his own carefully constructed isolation. "All right," he said quietly. "We tell him everything, and we deal with whatever comes after." The relief on Clara's face was so profound it almost hurt to see. She sagged against him, and Jonas wrapped his arms around her, feeling the way her body trembled with released tension. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, before finally separating and returning to where Hartwell waited on the porch. "There is gold," Jonas said without preamble. $17,000 in coins hidden in a wooden crate under Clara's bed. "We don't know how it got there. Probably Henry's brother hid it before he died. Maybe as insurance, or maybe with plans to come back for it." Clara grabbed the crate when she ran, didn't even know what was in it at first. Just knew it was heavy and valuable, and the only thing she could carry. Hartwell absorbed this information with the calm of a man who'd expected as much. "And where is it now?" "Hidden on my property. Safe, secure, untouched, except for Clara counting it to see how much was there." "You planning to spend it?" Clara admitted. Or at least we were trying to figure out how to spend it without drawing attention. But it's been nothing but trouble since the moment I picked up that crate. Men have died for it, lies have been told because of it, and now we've got Carson watching our every move waiting for us to slip up. Honestly, Sheriff, right now I'd almost be relieved to give it back and be done with it. Hartwell lit his cigarette, now taking a long drag before speaking. That'd be one solution. Give Carson what he wants, let him take it back to California, wash your hands of the whole mess. But before you make that decision, there's something else you should know. What? Jonas asked. I did some checking after Carson left my office. Sent telegrams to colleagues in California, asked about this mining consortium he claims to represent. Turns out the company exists and gold was stolen from them, just like Carson said. But here's the interesting part. The company reported $12,000 stolen, not $17,000, which means either someone's lying about how much was taken, or, he paused significantly, or 5,000 of that gold never belonged to the mining company in the first place. Claire's breath caught. You're saying some of it might actually have been Henry's brother's, legitimately his. I'm saying the math doesn't add up. And in my experience, when the math doesn't add up, it's usually because someone's cooking the books. Could be the mining company inflated their loss for insurance purposes. Could be Henry's brother stole the $12,000, then added his own $5,000 to it for safekeeping. Or could be something else entirely. Point is, you might have a legal claim to at least part of that gold. Jonas felt hope flicker in his chest, fragile as candlelight in wind. So what do we do? First thing, I need to see the gold, verify it exists, document it for my records. Then we need to figure out exactly how much is there and whether any of it can be identified as belonging to the mining company specifically. They put serial numbers or marks on their gold, we can separate out what's theirs from what's not. After that, Hartwell shrugged. After that, we see if we can come to some kind of arrangement that satisfies Carson's employer without leaving you two destitute. Why are you helping us? Clara asked suddenly. You're the law. You could just confiscate the gold, turn it over to Carson, close the case, and go home. Why go through all this trouble? Hartwell took another drag on his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the darkness. Because I've been wearing a badge for 20 years, Mrs. Mercer, and in that time I've learned that the law and justice aren't always the same thing. The law says stolen property should be returned to its rightful owner. But justice says a woman who watched her husband die, who ran for her life through the darkness, who's been beaten and traumatized and had her whole world destroyed, justice says that woman deserves something, deserves a chance to rebuild. And if I can find a way to give you that chance while still satisfying the legal requirements of my position, then that's what I'm going to do. Jonas felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he'd been carrying since the moment Clara collapsed at his gate. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet. We've still got work to do, and Carson's not going to make this easy. But at least now we're all working toward the same goal instead of dancing around each other. Hartwell crushed out his cigarette under his boot. Now how about that coffee you didn't offer me earlier? And then you can show me where you've got this gold hidden. They gathered in the kitchen, the three of them, and Clara made coffee strong enough to strip paint, while Jonas explained where the gold was hidden. It felt strange, liberating, almost to finally tell someone the complete truth without hedging or misdirection. The words came easier than he'd expected, and by the time he finished explaining everything from the moment Clara collapsed at his gate to the confrontation with Carson that afternoon, Jonas felt lighter, as if confession itself had weight that could be shed. Hartwell listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a clarifying question, but mostly just absorbing information with the practiced attention of someone who'd heard 1,000 stories and learned to pick truth from fabrication. When Jonas finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair and sighed. That's quite a tale, and I believe every word of it, which should probably worry me from a professional standpoint. He sipped his coffee, wincing slightly at its strength. All right, here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow morning, early, we dig up that gold and bring it to my office. I document it, count it, make a full inventory. Then I send word to Carson that the gold's been located and is in official custody pending determination of ownership. Won't that just bring him down on us faster? Clara asked. It'll bring him to my office, not your ranch. And once the gold's in official custody, he can't claim you're hiding it or trying to abscond with it. Takes away his leverage, forces him to work through legal channels instead of showing up here with threats and implied violence. Hartwell set down his cup. Meanwhile, I'll be working on proving that at least part of that gold has legitimate claim questions. The mining company wants their $12,000 back fine. We can probably arrange that. But the other $5,000 that stays in dispute until we can prove one way or another who it belonged to originally. And if we can't prove it, Jonas asked, then we argue possession. The gold was found on Clara's property in her house, suggesting her family had legitimate access to it. Burden of proof shifts to the mining company to prove it all belonged to them. And unless they can do that definitively, which I doubt they can, we might be able to negotiate a settlement. Maybe you end up with half of the disputed amount, maybe less. But it's better than nothing, and it's legal defensible, and most importantly, it ends this situation. Clara looked at Jonas' question in her eyes, and he saw his own thoughts reflected back at him. It wasn't perfect. They wouldn't keep all the gold, might not keep most of it, but they'd be free from lies, from fear, from the weight of secrets that had been crushing them. And freedom, Jonas was learning, was worth more than any amount of gold. We'll do it, Jonas said. Your way, tomorrow morning. Hartwell stood extending his hand first to Jonas, then to Clara. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's going to be complicated, and you'll want to be sharp for whatever comes next. And Mrs. Mercer. I meant what I said earlier. I'm sorry for your loss. Henry was a good man, and he deserved better than what he got. But at least now, maybe we can make sure his death means something, that you get the security he would have wanted you to have. After the sheriff left, Jonas and Clara stood together on the porch, watching his silhouette disappear into darkness. The night was cool, carrying the first hints of autumn on the wind, and overhead the stars wheeled in their eternal dance. Are we doing the right thing? Clara asked quietly. I don't know, Jonas admitted, but it's the honest thing, and right now I think that matters more. Clara turned to face him, and in the starlight her face was luminous, beautiful, despite the fading evidence of violence. Jonas, I need to tell you something about us, about this arrangement we have. Jonas felt his heart rate pick up, but forced himself to stay calm. What about it? When we started this pretend marriage, this performance, I thought it would be simple. Just a convenient lie to explain my presence here, to give us both cover while we figured out what to do about the gold. But somewhere along the way it stopped feeling like pretend. She reached up, touching his face with fingers that trembled slightly. You've been kind to me, patient, strong when I needed strength, gentle when I needed gentleness. You've given me a home when I had nowhere else to go, protected me when others would have turned me away. And I've realized that I don't want this to be pretend anymore. I want it to be real. Jonas couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could barely process what she was saying. Clara, I'm not asking you to love me. I know it's too soon, know that I'm still grieving Henry and probably will be for a long time. But I'm asking if maybe eventually this could become something more than just convenience. Something real, something worth building on. Jonas thought about the past 3 weeks, about watching Clara transform his lonely bachelor's cave into a home, about conversations over coffee and shared labor and quiet evenings on the porch, about the way his heart had started beating faster when she smiled, the way he'd started looking forward to her presence instead of just tolerating it, about how empty the house would feel if she left. I'd like that, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. I'd like that very much. Clara smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over mountains, slow, inevitable, transforming everything it touched. She leaned up and kissed him, just a brief touch of lips that was equal parts promise and question, and Jonas felt something he'd thought died in the war flicker back to life. Hope. The belief that maybe, just maybe, his future held something more than solitude and regret. They stood together under the stars, two broken people beginning to heal, beginning to build something new from the ruins of their old lives. And if the path ahead was uncertain, if challenges still waited to test them, at least they'd face those challenges together. Not alone, never alone again. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made promises feel possible. Jonas and Clara worked together to excavate the gold from its hiding place in the barn, hauling the heavy crate into full daylight for the first time since Clara had grabbed it during her desperate flight. In sunshine, the coins gleamed like captured fire, beautiful and dangerous and worth all the trouble they'd caused. They loaded the crate into the wagon and made the journey to Bitter Creek, this time without fear or deception weighing them down. Sheriff Hartwell was waiting in his office, and together they counted the coins, documenting each one in meticulous detail. $17,340 to be exact, even more than Clara had originally estimated. As Hartwell had predicted, word reached Carson within hours. The private investigator appeared at the sheriff's office before noon, his face flushed with triumph that quickly faded when he realized the gold was in official custody and beyond his reach. "I'll need to verify these are the coins stolen from my employer," Carson said, studying the inventory list. "You do that," Hartwell replied calmly. "Take all the time you need. But until you can prove definitive ownership of specific coins, this gold remains in my custody, and its disposition remains under my jurisdiction. You want to argue otherwise, take it up with the territorial marshal. I'm sure he'll be fascinated to hear all about it." The legal wrangling took months. Lawyers got involved, documents were exchanged, arguments were made and countered. The mining consortium proved ownership of $12,000 worth of coins. They had detailed records of serial numbers and mint marks that matched. But the remaining $5,340, those coins' origins remained murky, impossible to definitively trace. In the end, they settled. The mining company got their $12,000 back. Of the remaining amount, half went to Clara as compensation for her losses and trauma, while the other half was split between the territorial government and a fund for victims of crime. Clara ended up with just over $2,600. Not the fortune she'd once possessed, but enough to build something real, something honest, something untainted by lies and death. Through it all, Jonas and Clara's relationship deepened and grew. The pretend marriage became real in a quiet ceremony with Sheriff Hartwell as witness, and if some people in Bitter Creek whispered about the speed of it all, Clara found she didn't care. She'd learned that survival sometimes meant doing things that looked improper to people who'd never faced death in the darkness. They used Clara's settlement money wisely, not for luxuries or excess, but for improvements to the ranch. A new barn, better livestock irrigation for the expanded garden. They hired a hand to help with the heavy work, a young man named Thomas, who reminded Jonas painfully of his friend Tommy from the war, but in a good way. The ranch prospered, and slowly, carefully, Jonas and Clara built the life that Henry had once dreamed of, a life of honest work, simple pleasures, and the deep satisfaction of creating something worthwhile. On cool evenings, they'd sit together on the porch Jonas had repaired, watching the sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Sometimes they'd talk, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, content just to be together. And always Jonas would feel grateful for the night Clara had collapsed at his gate for the choice he'd made to help, instead of turning away for the violence and fear and lies that had somehow impossibly led to this moment of peace. A year after Clara first arrived, Sheriff Hartwell rode out to the ranch for what he called a social visit, but what Jonas suspected was a welfare check. They gave him coffee and pie Clara had baked and sat together talking about nothing in particular, weather and cattle prices and the new schoolteacher in town who was causing quite a stir among the local bachelors. Before he left, Hartwell pulled Jonas aside. "You did good, Mercer, both of you. Could have gone bad in 100 different ways, but you kept your heads, did the right thing in the end. I'm proud to know you." "We couldn't have done it without your help," Jonas said honestly. "You gave us a way out when we couldn't see one. I gave you options. You made the choices." Hartwell mounted his horse, then paused. "One more thing. Carson. He left the territory 6 months ago, moved on to some other case. Man who hired him decided it wasn't worth the cost of pursuing what he couldn't prove. You're clear, both of you. No more looking over your shoulders." After Hartwell left, Jonas found Clara in the garden, harvesting tomatoes in the late afternoon sun. Her dress was simple calico. Her hands were dirty from work, and her face bore the kind of contentment that came from honest labor and clear conscience. She looked up when she heard him approach, and her smile was everything he'd never known he needed. "The sheriff says we're clear," Jonas reported. "Carson's gone. No more investigators, no more questions. It's really over." Clara set down her basket and came to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Then we're free. Finally, truly free." Jonas held her close, breathing in the smell of earth and sunshine and tomato plants, and marveled at how much his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been alone, isolated, slowly calcifying into permanent solitude. Now he had a wife, a home that felt lived in, and loved, a future that stretched bright and promising into the distance. "Thank you," Clara murmured against his chest, "for saving me, for standing by me, for being exactly who I needed when I needed it most." "You saved me too," Jonas said. "Maybe more than I saved you, gave me reason to be more than just a ghost haunting his own life." They stood together as the sun set, painting the world in fire and gold, and Jonas thought about the crate of coins that had caused so much trouble. In the end, the gold had been less important than what it had brought them each other. The violence that had marked their beginning had forged them into something stronger, something capable of surviving. Not just the physical dangers of the territory, but the more insidious threats of isolation, despair, and the kind of loneliness that killed slowly from the inside out. Years later, when their children asked about how they met, Jonas and Clara would exchange glances and tell a simplified version of the truth. They'd mention violence and danger, courage and survival, but they'd emphasize the important parts: the choice to help, the decision to be honest, the gradual building of trust, and eventually love from the raw materials of trauma and fear. They'd leave out some details, soften others, but the core truth would remain: sometimes the worst nights of your life lead to the best mornings. Sometimes the fire that nearly kills you is the one that keeps you alive. And sometimes the person who collapses at your gate in the darkness becomes the light that guides you home. On the rise behind the barn, 4 graves stood witness to this truth. Henry Darnell, who died trying to protect information he didn't have. Jonas's parents and sister, who'd waited patient and silent for him to finally come home, not just in body, but in spirit. And nearby, though nobody but Jonas and Clara knew it, 3 unmarked graves holding men who died for gold they'd never spend. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of harvest. Cattle grazed peacefully, chickens scratched in the dirt, and smoke rose from the forge where Jonas had been working earlier, shaping raw metal into something useful and strong. And in the house that was no longer just shelter, but home, Clara Mercer, formerly Darnell, briefly alone, now found set the table for dinner and listened to her husband's footsteps on the porch, and thought about how strange and terrible and ultimately beautiful the path had been that led her here. The gold was gone, divided among claimants and governments, in compensation for suffering. But what remained was more valuable than any amount of coins could ever be: a life built on honesty, a love forged in fire, and the deep bone-settling peace of knowing that they'd survived the worst and come out the other side not just intact, but stronger. Together. Always together. The Montana sky wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, marking the passage of days and seasons and years. And beneath it, 2 souls who'd been broken by violence learned how to be whole again, proving that sometimes the most precious things in life aren't found or stolen or inherited. They're built, one difficult choice at a time, by people brave enough to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, and determined enough to do the hard work of making that belief come true.